Texas Sharpshooter. A company boasts, "Our drink reduces stress." 100% of users reported improved mood. What they don't say, they ran dozens of tests. Most showed nothing. But in one tiny subset, say left-handed night owls under 25, the data looked promising. So they painted a bright red bullseye around that one result and called it proof. That's the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy, when someone selectively highlights the data that supports their conclusion and ignores everything else. The name comes from a joke. A man fires bullets randomly at a barn, then walks up, paints a bullseye around the tightest cluster, and declares himself a marksman. In logic, it's the same move. You take unrelated points, isolate the ones that look like a pattern, and pretend it was intentional all along. It's not falsifying data, it's framing it to lie, by omission. This fallacy thrives in statistics, marketing, medical claims, and retrospective storytelling. It's not always intentional, but it's always misleading. In advertising, it's routine. A supplement company runs 30 blind studies. Most show no difference, but just two, suggest mild benefit under obscure conditions. Those two become the centerpiece of the campaign. Fine print hides the rest. In historical narrative, this fallacy rewrites causality. You look at a successful military leader and retroactively cherry-pick traits. He was decisive, ambitious, tall, then find those traits in someone else and claim they're destined for greatness. The failures with the same traits are buried. The logic works backwards from outcome to cause until coincidence looks like destiny. It happens in conspiracy theories too. A person sees that a celebrity tweeted about light the day before a solar flare. They search for other light references. They ignore all the times celebrities tweeted nonsense that meant nothing. Suddenly, there's a web, a pattern, a target that didn't exist before the dots were connected. And in sales, you'll hear, "Look at these 5 testimonials. This product changed their lives." What you won't hear, the hundreds who returned it, the thousands who said nothing, the silent majority erased in favor of a curated cluster. So why does it work? Because human brains crave coherence. We're uncomfortable with randomness. Patterns soothe us, even fake ones. The sharpshooter fallacy exploits that by backfilling purpose where there was only noise. It's a kind of psychological comfort food. It tells you there's a reason this worked, even if the reason was painted on after the fact. And the danger isn't just being misled. It's being certain while being misled. It doesn't feel like deception. It feels like insight. This fallacy grows stronger when people don't understand base rates, sampling bias, or false positives. It preys on the untrained eye, the viewer who sees the cluster but not the scatter. And once it's framed right, even skeptics struggle to unsee the bullseye. Historically, it's shaped narratives that feel airtight but crumble under audit. In war, politicians might justify a conflict by highlighting one enemy statement that seems to confirm intent while ignoring thousands of unrelated or contradictory signals. They build a moral bullseye around coincidence, then justify blood. In religion or spirituality, a prayer that coincides with recovery becomes a testimonial. The prayers that led nowhere, or the recoveries with no prayer at all, vanish. The target is painted around the story that survived, and in tech or finance, founders cherry-pick one case study where their product tripled productivity. They don't mention it failed in 12 other pilot programs. The narrative becomes linear. The scatter becomes invisible. How do you counter it? You don't just ask, what's being shown? You ask, what's being excluded? You demand raw data, not filtered highlight reels. You study the full pattern, not the painted target. In discussion, push for base rates. If someone says, this worked for 3 people, ask, out of how many? When a graph shows a spike, ask, where does the axis begin? When a company boasts one miraculous result, ask, how many trials didn't? This isn't cynicism, it's precision. Because painted bullseyes are convincing, especially when they're colored in red. But real logic asks whether the shots were aimed, or if we're just staring at a wall riddled with holes, desperate to find meaning in the noise. Red herring. A government faces scandal, corruption, embezzlement, public outrage. At the press conference, the official steps up and says, "We must remember the real threat here, foreign influence trying to divide us." Just like that, the room tilts. The scent of the original problem fades, and the crowd chases a new trail, far away from where the rot began. That's red herring, a fallacy that introduces an irrelevant topic to divert attention from the core issue. It doesn't answer the question. It changes the subject just enough to make it feel connected, and once people are chasing the wrong trail, the truth has already slipped away. The name comes from old hunting lore. Trainers would drag smoked red herring across the path of a scent trail to see if the dogs would get distracted. A good hound stayed on track, but a misled one sniffed the fish, lost the quarry, and followed a false lead to nowhere. Humans are no better. Our attention isn't fixed. It can be pulled if you know how to bait it. You don't have to lie to distract. You just need something vivid enough to make the original issue feel boring. A CEO is asked about exploitative wages. She responds by discussing the company's charity efforts. And the original topic is still sitting on the table, untouched, but now the spotlight is elsewhere. A partner is asked why they didn't show up to an important event. They pivot to how the other person never appreciates what they do right. Emotionally loaded, off-topic, effective. A political leader is questioned about surveillance. They respond with a passionate speech on national pride. The crowd claps, not because the question was answered, but because the air has changed. The fallacy works because it doesn't attack, it redirects. It turns the audience's focus from logic to novelty, from clarity to confusion. And once they're emotionally invested in the new direction, they often forget the original trail even existed. In sales, red herrings are weaponized. You ask a rep, "Why is this product more expensive than the competitors?" They launch into a story about how the company was founded by veterans, or how the CEO overcame hardship. Noble distractions, irrelevant to price, but enough to reframe the purchase as a moral decision. In online discourse, it thrives under the cloak of moral urgency. A post about environmental policy gets derailed by a passionate tangent on homelessness. Both topics matter, but that's the trick. A red herring isn't obviously fake. It's off-topic enough to feel righteous, but irrelevant enough to derail clarity. It becomes even more effective in high-conflict environments, where attention spans are short, where outrage spreads faster than analysis, where the crowd wants to feel like something is being said, even if it's the wrong thing. Debate shows love this tactic. Instead of answering, the guest attacks the format, criticizes the audience, or reframes the debate, and the audience forgets what the question even was. Red herring works because it replaces tension with momentum. It gives people somewhere else to run, emotionally, intellectually, and that relief feels like resolution. But it isn't. It's escape disguised as insight. So what can you do? Anchor to the question. When the conversation swerves, drag it back. Ask, how does this relate to the original point? Don't let emotion or moral weight disguise irrelevance. It takes discipline, especially when the new trail feels important. Because sometimes a red herring isn't outrageous, it's persuasive. It makes you feel wise for chasing it. But thinking clearly means knowing not just what's being said, but what's being ignored. And once you know the scent of the real issue, no fish, no matter how red, should pull you off the trail. Loaded question. A journalist leans forward and asks a senator, "Why are you willing to sacrifice children's safety just to support your donors?" The senator pauses. There's no clean answer. Silence feels like guilt. Denial sounds like a lie. Even calling it a bad question makes you sound evasive. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was embedded in the question itself. This is the loaded question fallacy, a rhetorical trap where the question assumes a premise that hasn't been agreed upon. By answering it directly, you accidentally validate the trap. Even silence can sound like confession. It's not a flawed argument. It's something more surgical, a structure designed to make you guilty by response. The power of the fallacy comes from its framing. It shifts the burden of proof. Instead of defending an idea, you're defending yourself. Instead of examining the question, you're too busy trying to survive it. We see this tactic in legal cross-examinations. Have you stopped manipulating data in your reports? Answering yes implies past guilt. Answering no implies ongoing deceit. The real trap is the hidden assumption that manipulation ever occurred at all. It slips into personal conflict too. Why do you always make everything about you? No matter how calm your response, the question has already painted your character in ink. You're no longer clarifying, you're just swimming against implication. It thrives in public debate. On social media, people weaponize it with subtle phrasing. So why are you okay with letting the poor starve? So you're fine with censorship if it's your side doing it. These aren't just questions, they're verdicts in disguise. And they rely on speed. The quicker the conversation moves, the less likely anyone will stop to ask, wait, is that even a fair assumption? In marketing and sales, it shows up as false dilemmas baked into casual pitch language. Would you rather keep struggling with generic solutions, or try our product today? No middle ground, no validation of existing methods, just a choice framed to make resistance sound irrational. That's what makes loaded questions dangerous. They're not just manipulative, they simulate logic. While denying you the ability to reason, it often hides in moral conversations, where emotions are high and patience is low. Why are you against progress? Why do you support policies that hurt children? Why do you always side with oppressors? Each question is wearing armor, not because it's strong, but because it dares you to disagree without sounding cruel. It's a linguistic form of hostage-taking. Challenge the premise, and you look heartless. This kind of framing is especially effective when audiences don't notice. Most listeners, consciously or not, absorb the structure of the question as part of the answer. And so, even if the accused responds eloquently, the scent of guilt lingers in the room. Because the question wasn't neutral, it tilted the world before the conversation began. That's what separates loaded questions from honest inquiry. They aren't searching for truth. They're engineered to corner the opponent. You're not discussing issues anymore. You're navigating landmines. There's no elegant way to win these exchanges, but there is a way not to lose. Rather than take the bait, you name what the question is doing. You don't just disagree, you reveal the construction. I reject the assumption hidden in that question, so that presumes something I haven't agreed to. Or sometimes let's unpack that before I answer it. You don't have to look evasive. You can sound calm, but exact. You can make the trick visible. And once it's visible, it often falls apart under its own weight. People often assume that persuasion is about clever answers, but sometimes it's about refusing to answer on someone else's dishonest terms. If truth is a conversation, loaded questions are the trapdoors beneath it. And the smartest response isn't to choose a side of the trap, it's to step off the stage entirely and start asking your own questions. Quoting out of context. In a heated election year, a politician's voice booms across the news. I don't care what happens to the workers. Outrage follows. Headlines erupt. Condemnations stack. What the clip left out? The full sentence was, I don't care what happens to the workers, because under our plan, they'll be fully protected. The quote was real. So was the damage. This is quoting out of context. A fallacy that takes a statement, slices it away from its surroundings, and weaponizes what remains. It's not a lie of invention. It's a lie of subtraction. Unlike loaded questions or circular reasoning, this fallacy doesn't change what was said. It changes when, why, and how it was said. It relies on the silence before and after, the lines never heard, the conditions left unseen. And in that silence, meaning is rewritten. You'll find this fallacy scattered across media timelines like landmines. In one infamous case, a scientist discussing climate trends was quoted saying, "There is no warming happening." Outrage spread. But the full sentence was, "There is no warming happening this month compared to the last." But the long-term data is undeniable. The context turns certainty into denial. One phrase extracted, clipped, and dropped into an entirely different conversation. That's the trick. Context isn't decoration, it's structure. Remove it, And even truth can be distorted into its opposite. It isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's laziness. A student grabs a quote from a philosopher to support an essay, unaware that it was meant sarcastically. Sometimes it's desperation. An advertiser cherry-picks a sentence from a lukewarm review, a surprisingly decent product, and features only surprisingly product in bold print. Sometimes it's drama. A journalist needs a headline, and nothing pulls traffic like a scandal manufactured from 6 cropped words. The danger of this fallacy isn't just miscommunication, it's moral distortion. A person defending human rights can be made to look cruel. A reformer trying to find compromise can be framed as betraying principle. A thinker raising a complex problem can be turned into a bigot with one line stripped of nuance. It rewrites history one sentence at a time. Entire reputations have collapsed under quotes that were technically real and contextually dishonest. But why does it work? Because humans are pattern-hungry and time-starved. We want to believe we can judge an argument, a person, or a policy in one soundbite. And in a world of scrolls and clips, there's little incentive to ask, what came before this line? What came after? Was this question ironic, literal, quoted from someone else entirely? Our memory trims complexity, and manipulators know it. They don't need to invent a lie. They just need to trim the truth until it fits a different shape. In religion, texts thousands of years old are sliced into meme-worthy maxims, wielded in arguments the original authors could never have imagined. In law, a clause removed from its paragraph can shift an entire judgment, just enough to tilt a verdict. In interpersonal conflict, even a well-meaning friend can be quoted out of context in a group chat and suddenly seem cruel or duplicitous. What matters isn't what was said. What matters is what was left in and what was deliberately cut out. This fallacy can't be defeated with cleverness, only diligence. When you hear something shocking, ask for the full clip, the full chapter, the complete quote. When someone presents a damning sentence, look for punctuation, look for framing, look for intent. Context isn't optional. It's the only thing keeping language honest. And if you're the one being quoted, don't just clarify, expose the edit. Call attention not just to what you said, but what they erased to make you say something else. Because quoting out of context isn't a mistake, it's a scalpel. And once you understand how it's used, you stop chasing the quote and start asking, who's holding the knife? Incomplete comparison. A cereal box boasts, now with 20% more nutrition. More than what? The old version? The competitors? A bowl of cardboard? No one knows. And that's the point. Incomplete comparison is a fallacy that offers a statement of superiority without specifying what it's being compared to. It creates a sense of improvement or dominance by floating above any actual standard. It doesn't have to lie. It just withholds enough information to let your imagination do the rest. This fallacy thrives when numbers look impressive, but meaning is scarce. A car ad claims 30% safer in crash tests. But safer than what? Than the last model? Than an actual brick wall? The comparison is left blank, and the audience fills in the gap, usually with something favorable. Why? Because people assume context. We trust that if something is being compared, it must be to something legitimate. But incomplete comparison manipulates that trust, feeding you an upward arrow and hiding the axis underneath. It's subtle, deceptively so, because it plays by the rules of logic, grammatically correct, numerically sound, but structurally meaningless. Politicians love it. We've reduced crime rates. Which crime? Which region? Compared to which year? Statistics are thrown like grenades. If no one checks the denominator, the explosion still lands. In marketing, it's nearly invisible. To vitamin supplement says, delivers better results. Then what? A placebo? A competitor? Tap water? Sometimes it's literal nonsense. We're the fastest growing brand in our category, and the category could be 5 obscure products in a market no one tracks. But the audience sees fastest and doesn't think to ask, what race is even being run? Psychologically, this fallacy works because the human mind prefers relative thinking. We don't need full data to form judgments. We just need the suggestion of advantage. So when a claim says stronger, our brain slots in whatever it already dislikes or fears as the weaker counterpart. The fallacy thrives on ambiguity disguised as clarity. It lets the speaker sound confident while dodging every burden of evidence. In retail, it's weaponized constantly. A shirt is advertised as 50% more durable. It doesn't say what the baseline was, could be compared to tissue paper, or the same company's cheapest design. The wording creates an illusion of toughness, not a promise. Even in interpersonal disputes, this logic shows up. You're being more selfish than usual. More than when? Under what standard? The claim presses emotional weight without providing an anchor. And the worst part, once the comparison lands, the lack of context becomes irrelevant. People remember the impact, not the emptiness beneath it. News outlets run headlines like "Study finds students more distracted in class." Compared to what? Last year? Adults? Other mammals? It doesn't matter. The phrase is sticky, the comparison vague, and the damage is done. So what's the smarter move? Not to demand every claim include a bibliography, but to ask the question that the fallacy tries to suppress, compared to what, exactly? When that question becomes a reflex, the spell weakens. Incomplete. Comparisons depend on momentum, on your willingness to be impressed before you've seen the full picture. But once you start slowing down the moment the arrow goes up, you'll start noticing the missing axis, the cropped chart, the better that never named its rival. Anyone can say something is stronger. Fewer can explain than what. Fewer still can prove it. And once you've trained your eye to see those gaps, not just what's said, but what's being silently assumed, you don't need to argue, you just tilt your head and let the silence fill in what the claim refused to. Middle ground fallacy. A scientist says the Earth is round. A conspiracy theorist says it's flat. Someone shrugs and says maybe it's a bit of both. It sounds open-minded. It sounds diplomatic. But it's not clarity. It's surrender in disguise. The middle ground fallacy happens when someone assumes that the truth must lie exactly between two opposing views, simply because those views exist. It's the belief that compromise equals correctness. And in many situations, that instinct to find balance, to hear both sides, is admirable. But when the extremes aren't symmetrical, meeting in the middle doesn't land you at truth. It lands you in a fiction made of false equivalence and fear of judgment. This fallacy is one of the most socially rewarded forms of flawed thinking. Why? Because it feels wise. It presents itself as the cooler head, the moderator, the rational adult in the room, and it protects the person using it from the risk of taking a position. You don't have to know what's true, you just have to avoid sounding extreme. It's why news outlets, especially during controversy, are drawn to it. They present both sides even when one side is backed by evidence and the other by noise. Climate scientists warn of ecological collapse. A handful of deniers say it's all a hoax. A middle ground thinker suggests, well, the truth must be somewhere between those positions. But it's not. Truth isn't determined by averaging opinions. It's determined by logic, evidence, and reasoned judgment, even if that leads to an uncomfortable edge. You see this in historical atrocities. When human rights activists condemned apartheid, some international leaders sought a balanced perspective. They argued for understanding both sides. But one side was enforcing systemic racial domination. The other was fighting for dignity. No middle ground existed, only delay. And the fallacy prolonged the pain. In sales, it appears when a customer compares two wildly different products. One overpriced and low quality, one high-end and fair. A third, seemingly compromised product is introduced right between them. It feels safe, reasonable, balanced, and it's carefully placed there to exploit the instinct that middle correct. In family disputes, it shows up when someone refuses to side with a victim because both people probably made mistakes. Even when one side was abusive, the fallacy paints neutrality as maturity. But neutrality is not always moral, and compromise is not always ethical. Sometimes, the middle is a cop-out wrapped in virtue. So why does this fallacy persist? Because psychologically, moderation feels safe. Extremes require certainty. Certainty requires work, and often, social risk. The middle path feels like intellectual Switzerland, unoffending, immune to conflict, and too calm to be wrong. It offers distance from outrage. It presents the illusion of having considered all angles. But often, it ignores the actual weight of arguments, as if facts and fabrications carry the same gravity. It also thrives in a culture that mistrusts conviction, where taking a stance is seen as arrogance, where fence-sitting is confused with critical thinking. The middle ground fallacy exploits that discomfort. It offers a third rail, where there shouldn't be one. This fallacy becomes especially dangerous in moments that require moral clarity. When one side calls for genocide and another calls for peace, the middle is not diplomacy, it's cowardice. When one group spreads disinformation and another fights for truth, splitting the difference doesn't make you thoughtful, it makes you complicit. There are situations where compromise makes sense. But this fallacy doesn't compromise based on substance. It splits things because they appear opposite, not because they actually are. It can't be solved by teaching balance. Balance is already there. What's missing is the courage to evaluate the merit of each side independently. You don't ask, what's halfway between these opinions? You ask, what's actually true, regardless of where the extremes stand. And if that truth happens to align with one side fully, you don't flinch, you don't feel guilty. You stand there, even if the middle looks more comfortable. Because wisdom doesn't mean cutting every argument in half. Sometimes it means walking past the illusion of compromise and accepting that some positions don't deserve your neutrality. Not every path worth walking has a middle. False dilemma. You're told, either you support the new security law, or you're fine with terrorists roaming free. Two options. Pick one. Everything else is erased. This is the false dilemma, a fallacy that frames a complex issue as having only two possible outcomes, positions or solutions. No nuance, no gradients, just a forced binary. And in that narrowing of thought, something dangerous happens. Possibility dies. False dilemmas thrive in high-stakes conversations, and they almost always serve power. When someone wants you to act fast, to stop questioning, to feel like the choice is obvious, they compress the world into opposites. Support us or support chaos. Agree or be the enemy. Act now or suffer forever. The structure is simple, seductive, and suffocating. In relationships, it appears like this. If you really loved me, you'd do this. The suggestion isn't just that your refusal means disagreement, it means a lack of love. The other possibilities, misunderstanding, boundary, timing, are gone. Love becomes a test. The test becomes a trap. In politics, this fallacy is campaign fuel. A candidate says, you're either for economic growth or for regulation, but these aren't opposites. They coexist in every functioning society. Yet when one is framed as the enemy of the other, the crowd roars, not because they understand the trade-offs, but because the illusion of choice makes them feel decisive. The most dangerous part. It feels clarifying. It feels like truth. And that's exactly why it's used. Marketers weaponize it. Do you want to keep feeling tired and underperforming, or do you want to be your best self? That's the choice, weakness, or the product. They don't say, or try sleeping more, exercising, or checking your health. Too many options. The sale dies in complexity. So they offer two roads, suffer or buy, and you buy. This fallacy thrives in moments of fear, because fear narrows perception. It pushes the brain toward quick categories, safe versus unsafe, us versus them, survive versus die, and false dilemma piggybacks on that panic. Think of wartime rhetoric. You're either with us or against us. No room for critique, no room for third positions. The nuance is flattened, because when you flatten the frame, you flatten the resistance. In historical context, this logic justified horrors.
During the Red Scare, citizens were told,
you're either a patriot or a communist. The middle ground, disagreement, dissent, intellectual exploration, was erased. Careers destroyed, lives ruined. Not because of proven betrayal, but because there were only two boxes, and someone didn't fit cleanly into the first. Even in debates over morality, this fallacy blinds insight. Someone says, if you don't support this activist movement, you're a bigot. Or, if you criticize this tradition, you hate your culture. But disagreement doesn't always mean opposition. Critique doesn't always mean rejection. And supporting a cause doesn't mean agreeing with every part of it. When people are forced into absolutes, they become defensive. And when they're defensive, they stop thinking. They just choose sides. That's the fallacy's final effect. It makes thought itself feel like betrayal. So what cuts through it? Not balance, not politeness, but refusal to accept the frame. Don't argue which of the two options is better. Ask, why are those the only two? That one question splinters the illusion. It reminds everyone that options weren't discovered, they were constructed. Because false dilemma isn't just an error in logic, it's a tool of control. And once you recognize the blueprint, the way it removes the middle, burns the bridge, and dares you to jump, you stop walking its path. You start building your own. Ad hominem. A public health expert presents research on a new medication. A commentator replies, "Didn't this guy fail out of med school once? Why should we trust him?" Not a word about the evidence. Just a jab at the person. The debate is no longer about what was said, it's about who said it. That's ad hominem, Latin for to the person. It's a fallacy that avoids confronting ideas by attacking the speaker's character, history, motives, or identity. It swaps evidence for insult, and once it lands, it shifts the burden from facts to defensiveness. This fallacy takes many forms. Some are blunt. He's a liar, so his argument must be false. Others are smoother. Of course she'd say that. She's from insert group. But in each case, the core move is the same. Ignore the reasoning. Discredit the person. It's especially common in politics. A senator proposes legislation. Instead of debating the policy, opponents dig up an old scandal or donation. The goal isn't to refute, it's to contaminate. In personal arguments, it plays out like this. You're just saying that because you're bitter. Even if the point is valid, the speaker is dismissed as emotionally compromised. It's the intellectual version of changing the subject, except you change it to the speaker's flaws. Why does it work? Because character is sticky. Once doubt is cast on someone's motives or morals, everything they say is heard through a filter, and the audience, often untrained in logic, feels safer judging people than arguments. Ad hominem appeals to the tribal brain. It's not, is this idea sound? It's, can we trust this person? And trust once dented can overshadow truth. In media debates, this fallacy turns reasoning into theater. A guest brings up crime statistics. A host replies, "Weren't you arrested once?" The crowd laughs. The claim evaporates. No one checks whether it was true. The speaker has already been neutralized. It's a shortcut to delegitimize without engaging. Fast, effective, and damaging. History is littered with its consequences. Reformers were discredited not by dismantling their ideas, but by attacking their race, religion, or personal life. Some of the most groundbreaking thinkers were ridiculed or smeared, not because their reasoning failed, but because their identities made people uncomfortable, and we still carry that impulse. Sometimes subtly, sometimes with venom. You don't need to be flawless to be right. You don't need to be likable, or respected, or admired, to say something that holds up. And when someone avoids the topic by making it personal, they've already told you they don't have a better argument. What's a sharper response? Stay with the claim. Pin the conversation back to the point. You don't have to defend your character. You weren't the subject to begin with. When someone throws an ad hominem, let them have the insult. Then, calmly return to the data. Because no matter how messy the speaker, truth doesn't care where it comes from. And neither should the conversation. Personal incredulity. A man reads a headline about quantum entanglement, particles affecting each other instantly across space. He scoffs, "That makes no sense. I don't believe it." No attempt to understand, just a wall built out of confusion. This is personal incredulity. The fallacy of assuming something must be false simply because it seems difficult to grasp, unfamiliar, or counterintuitive. It replaces investigation with dismissal and masks a lack of understanding as a flaw in the idea itself. This fallacy thrives on a simple reflex. If I can't imagine it, it can't be true. You'll hear it in conversations about science. I just don't get how a universe can come from nothing, as if the limits of personal comprehension draw the borders of reality. You'll hear it in social issues. I don't see how someone can identify that way. It's unnatural, as if understanding someone's experience is required for it to be valid. You'll hear it in politics. I can't believe people voted for that. It's insane, as if unfamiliar views are automatically irrational ones. It's not just skepticism. Skepticism asks for clarity. Personal incredulity shuts the door and turns off the light. It's easy to fall into because the brain tends to mistrust what it can't simulate. If something doesn't fit an internal model, if we can't explain it in a few mental steps, we flag it as broken, not as unfamiliar. But complexity doesn't mean falsehood, and counterintuition isn't a red flag. The world is full of systems that don't conform to how we wish they worked. Technology, evolution, mathematics, cultural identity, ethics, every one of them has layers that seem illogical until you understand the frame they operate in. What feels like nonsense is often just missing background. This fallacy is also reinforced by ego. It's hard to admit when we don't know. So instead of saying, "I don't understand it yet," we say, "That's wrong." It protects self-image. And in public settings, it avoids embarrassment. But it also stops learning cold. In arguments, it becomes a shield. A person faced with unfamiliar logic won't critique the premises. They'll just say, "I don't buy it." Not because they've examined it, but because accepting it would require uncomfortable humility. In the marketplace, this fallacy shows up in how people evaluate new tools, platforms, or products. A system seems too complex. Instead of asking how it works, they assume it's a scam. In health decisions, it appears when someone hears a mechanism that doesn't match their understanding of the body. "I don't get how that could help," sounds like junk science. And in cultural conversations, it becomes a subtle kind of arrogance. If I can't relate to it, it must be made up. As if lived experience needs to pass through your own filter to exist. This fallacy doesn't spread by misinformation. It spreads by premature certainty, a kind of intellectual impatience. The idea that understanding should be instant or not worth pursuing. But truth doesn't owe us simplicity, and reality doesn't shrink to fit our grasp. The move forward is simple, but rare. When something sounds wrong, not because it conflicts with reason, but because it feels unfamiliar, pause. Ask what you might be missing. Assume the burden of comprehension isn't on the world, it's on you. Because admitting, "I don't understand," is not weakness. It's where serious thought begins. Slippery slope. A school proposes allowing students to wear sneakers instead of formal shoes. An outraged parent replies, "If we allow sneakers, what's next? Pajamas? Then nudity. Where do we draw the line?" That's the slippery slope fallacy in motion. The belief that permitting one small change will inevitably lead to extreme, disastrous consequences. It doesn't argue against the actual proposal. It argues against a hypothetical future version of it, exaggerated and often absurd. And it assumes the worst outcome is not just possible, but unavoidable. This fallacy often disguises itself as caution, but it's not about measured foresight. It's about fear, disguised as logic. A regulation gets proposed. Opponents warn, if we accept this one law, we open the floodgates to total government control. But the law in question is a basic safety requirement, not authoritarian rule. In relationships, it sounds like, "If I give in on this argument, you'll walk all over me forever." The immediate situation gets swallowed by imagined future pain. In social change, it's often loudest. "If we allow this one group more rights, soon they'll have special rights, and society will collapse." The slope isn't just steep, it's deliberately greased to ensure panic. This fallacy survives on momentum. It stacks assumptions quickly, so the listener doesn't notice how flimsy each step is. One weak link follows another, but the whole chain is marched across as if it was solid ground. Why does it resonate? Because the human mind is narrative-driven. We don't just see events. We instinctively look for sequences. We ask, what does this lead to? Slippery slope answers that question with a worst-case storyline and tells us it's inevitable. And once fear is introduced, the burden of proof shifts. Now, to support the original idea, you're asked to guarantee that nothing bad will ever come from it. That's not skepticism. That's paranoia in a lab coat. This fallacy is used often in propaganda. Totalitarian regimes frame minor dissent as the beginning of chaos. Speak against one policy, and you're accused of trying to destroy the country. The slope becomes a weapon, one that turns opposition into treason, reform into anarchy, and disagreement into danger. In courtroom rhetoric, it shows up when a defense lawyer says, if we convict based on this thin evidence, soon anyone can be imprisoned on hearsay. No focus on the actual case, just a domino line of imagined injustice. And in marketing, it's flipped to drive urgency. If you don't buy now, you'll fall behind. Then you'll lose your edge. Then you'll be obsolete. The slope becomes a sales funnel. What's often missing is mechanism. The fallacy doesn't just suggest consequences. It assumes no stopping point. That once you start down the hill, you have no agency, no brakes, no choice. But the world doesn't work like that. Policies have reviews. Relationships evolve. Boundaries can be negotiated. Life isn't a one-way slide. It's a staircase, one you can stop climbing any time. So when you hear a dire prediction framed as certainty, ask how we get from step 1 to step 6, and what's missing in between. Demand the mechanism, expose the empty joints, because once you slow the momentum, the slope flattens, and what looked like destiny turns out to be just an opinion in a hurry. Strawman. A city council proposes a plan to reduce traffic by adding bike lanes. An opponent responds, so now we're banning cars. What's next? Outlawing families who drive. That argument was never made, but it doesn't matter. The debate has shifted. Now it's about a version of the proposal that no one actually defended. This is the Strawman fallacy. When someone distorts an argument into something easier to attack, then defeats that distortion instead of engaging with the real position. It's not a response. It's a replacement. You'll see it wherever disagreement turns emotional. A person speaks out about rising housing costs. The rebuttal is, oh, so you just want to give everyone free stuff and punish hard workers. What was said gets replaced with what's easier to ridicule. The original idea vanishes behind a cartoon version of itself. This fallacy doesn't argue. It impersonates. It puts a wig and coat on a viewpoint, pushes it into the street, and then beats it down for show. In public discourse, this tactic spreads fast. During debates on healthcare reform, critics don't respond to specific proposals. Instead, they say, next thing you know, the government will decide who lives and dies. It's not the policy they're attacking. It's a fabricated version, dramatic, terrifying, and false. In moral or philosophical discussions, it's just as common. Someone argues for prison reform, and the reply is, so you think we should just let all criminals go free? This strategy doesn't clarify differences, it inflames them. Strawman works because most people argue from instinct, not transcripts. They respond to emotion, not nuance. And once a distorted version of an argument is repeated enough, even the original speaker ends up having to defend what they never said. It puts pressure on the wrong position and drags the discussion away from substance. The more complex the issue, the more likely someone will simplify it into something dumb enough to knock over. That's the point. Not to win the argument, to flatten it. In personal relationships, it's subtle but corrosive. A partner says, I feel like we don't spend as much time together. The reply, oh, so now I'm a terrible person who ignores you completely. That escalation rewrites the original statement. Now the conversation isn't about connection, it's about ego and injury. Strawman turns every concern into an accusation, and every disagreement into a personal attack. It becomes nearly impossible to resolve anything, because one side is no longer being heard, they're being fictionalized. This tactic isn't new. In historical debates, especially those involving civil rights, Activists were portrayed as violent radicals, regardless of what they actually said or did. It was easier to defeat the version that looked dangerous than to confront the reality that their arguments were grounded, reasoned, and threatening only to the status quo. Even today, people pushing for moderation are painted as traitors, and those pushing for justice are accused of chaos. The strawman isn't just a fallacy, it's a weapon for control. The best way to disarm it is clarity, not defensiveness, not escalation, just calmly returning to the actual position. This is what I said. Here's what I meant. Let's talk about the real version, not the one you created. It's not flashy, but it works. Because once the real argument is back on the table, the fake one can't stand. It burns easily. That's the thing about straw. Fallacy of the single cause. A company's sales drop. An executive declares, "It's because we changed the logo." No mention of rising competitors, price shifts, bad reviews, or market fatigue. Just one neat explanation, chosen for convenience, not complexity. This is the fallacy of the single cause. The mistake of assuming one factor is solely responsible for an outcome that likely has many. Simplifies events that aren't simple, and it offers a clean story where the truth is tangled. The name fits the image. Picture a train crash. Dozens of components failed. Brakes, signal, human error, track condition. But someone points to one loose bolt and says, "There, that's the cause." It's tidy, comforting, and wrong. In political debate, this fallacy is standard. A leader blames rising crime on video games, or unemployment on immigration, or mental health decline on social media. Each of those may play a part, but none act in isolation. The choice to focus on one, and only one, tells you more about the speaker than the problem. In history books, single cause stories get repeated because they're easier to teach. The war started because of an assassination. The empire fell because of corruption. The movement failed because of one weak leader. Real history is never so clean, but simple narratives survive better than complex ones. In personal life, it shows up during arguments and introspection. Someone says, "I failed the interview because I was nervous." They ignore the mismatch in experience, the rushed preparation, the unclear questions, all of it flattened into one emotion. Because naming one cause feels more satisfying than holding 5 vague ones in your hands. It's not always a lie. Sometimes it's just a defense against chaos. When life unravels, we crave an answer. A single answer. Something to grab onto when everything else feels out of reach. The problem is that when we reduce a problem to one cause, we often fix the wrong thing, or nothing at all. In policy, it leads to ineffective legislation. In relationships, it causes repeated arguments. In business, it encourages cycles of blame and cosmetic fixes. When someone insists this happened because of that, and offers nothing else, they may not be helping you understand. They may just be making it easier to move on. But ease is not clarity. The fallacy is reinforced by how we tell stories. Movies have villains. Courtrooms have guilty parties. Press releases name heroes and scapegoats. Multi-causality is too slow for headlines. Even in science, where systems are studied deeply, the media often plucks one variable: coffee causes cancer. The next week, coffee prevents cancer. Both based on studies that examined hundreds of overlapping conditions, boiled down to a single line for public digestion. The smarter habit is to resist the urge for simplicity. Not everything needs to be explained by one thing. Sometimes, the correct answer is, it's complicated. And here's what we know so far. That doesn't make you indecisive, it makes you honest. When someone says this happened because of that, you don't need to argue. You can just ask what else might have contributed. If the conversation can't hold more than one cause, it's probably not ready for the truth. False cause. A man wears a lucky shirt before a job interview. He gets the job. From that day forward, he never interviews without it. Not because it helped, but because something happened after something else. And that was enough to convince him they were connected. This is the false cause fallacy, when we assume that just because one event follows another, the first must have caused the second. In ancient Rome, a comet appeared, and shortly after, a war began. The Senate saw the timing and declared the comet an omen. For centuries, celestial events were blamed for everything from plagues to crop failure. No test, no evidence, just sequence as proof. It's the illusion of cause, a shadow mistaken for substance. The mistake often comes wrapped in timing. If B happened after A, then A must have caused B. But life isn't that clean. Coincidence mimics causality all the time. You eat a new food. That night you feel sick. Maybe it was the food, maybe it was the flu, or stress, or nothing at all. But the brain stitches the events together because they're close in time. And once that narrative is written, it's hard to delete. This fallacy thrives in political messaging. A new law passes, the economy rises. The headline says, policy success, pulse cess. But maybe the economy was already improving. Maybe the real driver was global trends, currency shifts, or seasonal hiring. The policy just happened to stand in the frame when the good news arrived. The same logic is used to assign blame. A mayor takes office. Crime goes up. Critics say, see what they've done. But no one checks the timeline. No one asks what was already in motion. In public debate, this fallacy sells because simplicity is persuasive. Saying, this caused that, is much easier than unpacking a web of contributing factors. In medicine, false cause is dangerous. Someone takes a supplement. Days later, their condition improves. So the cause might be the pill, or the body healing, or the passage of time. But the improvement becomes a testimonial, and soon, the product becomes a miracle, with no real proof behind it. This is how pseudoscience markets itself. Sell by piling up stories of timing, not evidence. And once people believe they were healed by something, taller dislodging that belief requires more than data. It challenges identity. In relationships, this fallacy becomes emotional shorthand. He stopped texting after I brought up the issue. I must have pushed him away. The mind links events and assigns meaning, but the silence could be unrelated. The cause, unknown. Still, the assumption solidifies what I did, what happened next. The fallacy feeds guilt, anger, fear, and it keeps people reacting to what they think caused something, rather than asking what actually did. In history, entire movements have been misjudged this way. A war ends after a particular speech. A revolution erupts after a single protest. The temptation is to name the moment. This is when it turned. But change is rarely born from one spark. It comes from pressure building over time. False cause reduces history to headlines and robs it of its complexity. What strengthens this fallacy is how easy it is to see patterns, even when they aren't there. Humans are wired for story. We'd rather believe something happened for a reason than accept randomness. But randomness exists, and even when there is a cause, it's rarely just one. This doesn't mean causes don't exist. It means cause takes work to verify. It needs more than timing. It needs mechanism, replicability, context. So when someone says, this caused that, to pause, ask what else was happening. Ask what evidence supports the link beyond the clock, because not everything that walks ahead to is leading. Moralistic fallacy. A news commentator, uncomfortable with a scientific finding, dismisses it flatly. Well, that can't be true. It's too disturbing to accept. That response isn't a critique. It's a rejection based on emotion, not because the evidence is weak, but because the outcome would feel wrong if it were true. This is the moralistic fallacy, the belief that something must not be true, simply because it would be bad if it were. It confuses how the world ought to be with how the world actually is. It's the inverse of the naturalistic fallacy, where the naturalistic says, it's true in nature, so it must be good. The moralistic says, it would be wrong if it were true, so it can't be. It replaces inquiry with comfort, and it pretends that moral values can bend reality into compliance. You'll find this fallacy in conversations about human behavior. A study shows that aggression may have evolutionary roots. The reaction, That's disgusting. It implies violence is natural, but nature doesn't ask for permission. Describing something isn't the same as endorsing it. The same happens with gender differences. Any claim that there are biological variances is treated as if it's an argument against equality. But acknowledging difference doesn't mean validating discrimination. Reality and justice are not enemies, unless we insist on making them. In politics, it creeps into rhetoric disguised as moral conviction. We can't be causing climate change. Humanity is better than that. Or no good society would allow these conditions to exist, so they must not exist. It's not just denial, it's willful refusal to see facts that conflict with an ideal self-image. And once that ideal becomes sacred, anything that threatens it becomes unthinkable, even if it's true. In public health, this fallacy can distort decision-making. Imagine a study suggests that certain preventative measures are less effective than once believed. Officials hesitate to share the data. People might lose trust or behave recklessly. But suppressing reality for moral reasons doesn't change what's true. It just slows our ability to respond honestly. The fallacy assumes that acknowledging an uncomfortable truth will cause harm, so it denies the truth altogether. It's fear disguised as ethics. In personal life, it shows up as refusal to accept hard emotional truths. Someone says, "My partner would never betray me." That would be unforgivable. But loyalty isn't a guarantee. It's a hope. And refusing to see the possibility doesn't prevent the pain. It just blinds you to the evidence. The same logic applies to family, friends, even institutions. We think they shouldn't lie to me, so they must not be. But reality isn't a reflection of what we believe others are capable of. It's just what is. This fallacy persists because people believe accepting dark truths will make them complicit. If you acknowledge that human nature includes violence, are you defending violence? If you admit systemic failure, are you saying it can't be fixed? Of course not. But the fear is there. So people retreat into what they want to be true and declare that anything else must be false. Recognizing this fallacy isn't about abandoning values. It's about separating moral judgment from factual observation. Wanting the world to be better is noble, but believing that it already is, simply because it should be, isn't nobility, it's negligence. Truth doesn't always flatter our ideals. Sometimes it confronts them, but if our values can't survive truth, they were never worth holding in the first place. Cherry picking. A wellness brand publishes 5 studies about their product. 3 show no measurable benefit. 1 shows a mild placebo effect. 1, under specific narrow conditions, shows a positive outcome. That's the one they put in bold on the packaging. The others vanish into footnotes, or are never mentioned at all. That's cherry picking, the selective use of data that supports a claim, while ignoring the data that doesn't. It's not lying. It's editing reality for convenience. And it's one of the most common ways that truth becomes distorted without ever being falsified. The metaphor is simple. Out of a tree full of fruit, some rotten, some just unripe, only the perfect cherries are picked and presented. They don't represent the tree, they just look like they do. In science, cherry picking undermines the process. A researcher runs multiple experiments. One produces the desired result by chance. It gets published, cited, and spread. The null results, equally valid, disappear. But over time, the literature skews toward false positives. Truth becomes a popularity contest among outcomes. In medicine, this fallacy creates false confidence. A drug shows promising effects in a small subgroup that becomes the headline, but the same drug failed in larger, more representative trials. The public only sees the success, and when harm eventually surfaces, it looks like a sudden surprise, but the warning signs were just filtered out. In the courtroom, lawyers use it to sway juries. Selective facts are arranged to make guilt look obvious. Context is stripped. Contradictions are excluded. What remains is a curated version of events, legally admissible, but morally dishonest. In politics, cherry-picking becomes the entire strategy. A leader points to 1 year of economic growth, while ignoring the 5 years of decline before it. Or touts a drop in crime in one district, ignoring a nationwide surge. The audience hears only the good cherries, never realizing the orchard's been on fire. Why does this tactic work? Because people don't verify balance, they assume it. If someone shows you 3 strong data points, you instinctively believe they're representative. Your brain fills in the rest. You assume they picked the best examples from a fair field, not from a manipulated one. Cherry picking thrives in systems where attention is short and trust is uneven. It's faster to process a polished claim than to examine what's been left out. And once someone has believed a cherry-picked argument, they become resistant to the full picture. The omitted data feels like an attack, not an expansion. Their certainty is built on a highlight reel. This fallacy also warps public dialogue. When activists, commentators, or influencers want to make a moral case, they select the most extreme example of their opposition, then pretend that it's typical. It's easier to fight a cartoon version of the other side than to acknowledge the full, messy range of views. Cherry-picking isn't just about facts, it's about controlling perception by shaping the data set. Fix isn't to distrust every claim, it's to notice when the claim feels too tidy. To ask, what aren't they showing me? How many examples didn't make the cut? What would the picture look like if all the data were on the table? You don't need every fact. You just need enough to know when someone is feeding you a curated sample and calling it reality. Suppressed correlative. 2 co-workers argue about who's hardworking. One says they put in 60-hour weeks. The other says they meet every deadline. A third person cuts in, look, everyone here is hardworking. If you have a job and show up, that counts. Suddenly, the category expands. Hardworking now covers everyone, regardless of intensity, discipline, or contribution. By stretching the definition too far, the distinction is erased, and when a distinction disappears, the conversation goes nowhere. That's suppressed correlative, a fallacy that works by redefining terms so that opposing concepts collapse into each other. A contrast is claimed, but then dissolved. Difference is acknowledged, and then denied. It's not always obvious. Because on the surface, it sounds inclusive, it sounds reasonable. Everyone's beautiful. Everything is art. Every opinion is valid. These feel comforting. But when every item in a category is included, the category stops having any meaning. If everything counts as brave, then we can no longer tell the difference between genuine risk and ordinary action. If every comment is criticism, then thoughtful analysis becomes indistinguishable from petty attack. This fallacy sneaks into everyday speech. Someone complains about being disrespected. The reply, well, I said hi to you this morning, that's respectful. Here respect has been stretched to such a basic gesture that the original complaint becomes invalid by definition. It turns the term into a rubber band, elastic enough to cover anything, but too flimsy to hold anything together. You'll see it in ideological battles. A reformer demands systemic change. An opponent says, Siren, but we've already made progress. Isn't that change too? By expanding change to include minimal surface-level improvements, they flatten the argument. They erase urgency by inflating the label. This is how the fallacy neutralizes pressure. It pretends that the problem has already been addressed, because it redefines the solution as something that's already happening. In art and culture, it shows up when criticism is deflected with overextension. This isn't a movie, it's just corporate advertising. The response, well, advertising is a form of expression too, isn't it? Now the word art covers everything from a poem to a press release. And if everything is art, the category loses all critical value. There's a difference between being open-minded and being undiscerning. Suppressed correlative leans into the latter, not out of curiosity, but out of evasiveness. It's also a common tactic in emotional manipulation. Someone says, you never listen to me. The reply is, I heard your voice, that counts. By narrowing the definition of listen to the act of hearing, they avoid the accusation entirely. The fallacy turns disagreement into definitional confusion. And once the boundaries of a concept are blurred, there's no way to argue inside it anymore. This isn't about becoming rigid with language, but when someone redefines a concept to avoid accountability, or to dull contrast, or to dismiss critique, that's not communication. That's a trap. Words need tension to mean anything. Hot implies cold. Right implies wrong. Generous implies restraint. When one side of the contrast is pulled so wide, it covers everything. The other side disappears. And once that happens, there's nothing left to push against. No space for precision. No framework for clarity. A blurred concept might feel inclusive, but clarity isn't cruelty. Precision isn't exclusion. It's how we think clearly in a world that constantly tries to flatten complexity into slogans. If every path is the same, you can't choose one. And if every position is valid, no one has to take a stand. Circular reasoning. A parent tells their child, "You have to follow the rules." The child asks, "Why?" "Because they're the rules." Nothing new is explained. The statement turns back on itself and points to the same idea for justification. That's circular reasoning. A fallacy in which the conclusion is built into the premise. It creates the illusion of an argument, but underneath the surface, it's just spinning in place. The structure is deceptively tidy. God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is true because it's the Word of God. The reasoning moves, but it never progresses. The claim depends on the truth of itself. You'll hear it in slogans, like "Our company is trustworthy because we always do what's right." Why is that trustworthy? Because they say it is. The explanation feels complete, but it's just a polished mirror reflecting itself. This fallacy is rarely noticed in real time, because the repetition often wears a disguise: confidence, authority, or emotional conviction. In politics, it appears when leaders claim their plan is good because it works. Pressed further, they define working as supporting their plan. It's a closed loop, one that's hard to exit once you've stepped inside. In education, a grading system is defended by saying, "These tests are valid because they measure intelligence." How do we know they measure intelligence? Because smart people score well on them. By folding the conclusion into the setup, scrutiny is avoided. Religious and philosophical debates often fall into this trap. Someone claims a belief is true because it aligns with their inner sense of truth, and that inner sense is trusted because of the belief it produces. The feedback loop feels spiritually sound, but it avoids external testing. It protects itself by being unreachable in sales and marketing. Circular logic is used to create brand loyalty. This product is high quality because it's a premium brand, and it's a premium brand because people associate it with high quality. No third-party evidence, just reputation justifying itself. In personal relationships, it becomes manipulation. "Why do you never trust me?" "Because you keep accusing me." And the accusation exists because of the lack of trust. Circular arguments don't resolve tension, they preserve it. They trap both parties in a loop that can't be argued out of, only escaped. This fallacy persists because it feels safe. It removes uncertainty. It offers a neat package, one that never requires you to examine your assumptions, because the assumptions and the conclusions are the same thing. It's especially effective in environments that reward quick answers over thoughtful ones. Public debates, media interviews, heated arguments, places where speed matters more than substance. The moment you slow the conversation down, the loop reveals itself. There's no foundation under the statement, just the statement again. To break it, you don't push harder. You step out and ask, what's this claim actually built on, aside from itself? If it can't be grounded in something else, evidence, logic, shared premises, then it's not an argument. It's a slogan with good posture. Repetition doesn't prove anything, and certainty built on itself is just a circle drawn with thicker ink. Hasty generalization. A man gets cut off in traffic by a luxury car. He mutters, "Typical, rich people can't drive." By the time he's home, the narrative has hardened. He doesn't remember the dozens of careful drivers he passed, only the one that confirmed the story he wanted to tell. That's hasty generalization. When someone draws a broad conclusion from a small or unrepresentative sample, one moment, one case, one interaction, turned into a rule. It's not just illogical, it's seductive, because one example is easier to remember than 1,000 exceptions. This fallacy is built on limited data and strong emotion. A A single experience feels intense, and the mind assumes it must be typical. You meet one rude tourist and start resenting their entire country. You hear one story of vaccine side effects and start distrusting all medicine. You get burned in a relationship and begin to say, people always leave. In each case, the story becomes a shortcut, not because it's statistically valid, but because it's memorable. Social media amplifies this fallacy daily. A video of one person behaving badly goes viral. The comment section turns that clip into proof of how they all are. Suddenly, one act becomes evidence for a sweeping stereotype. The algorithm doesn't reward context, it rewards emotion, and outrage sticks faster when it feels like part of a larger trend, even if that trend is entirely imagined. In political speech, hasty generalization becomes a rhetorical weapon. A single protest turns violent, and entire movements are declared dangerous. One case of welfare fraud is presented as the norm. One crime by a foreign national becomes a justification for broad policies. The point isn't accuracy, it's emotional momentum. Once the audience accepts the premise, I've seen it so it must be common, there's little room for statistical correction. In personal life, this fallacy shapes beliefs that feel justified, but quietly distort perception. A child who's embarrassed in class once may come to believe they're bad at public speaking. Someone rejected on a date might conclude they're undateable. A new employee who makes one early mistake might believe they're not cut out for the role. These conclusions aren't reasoned, they're reactions. And the longer they sit unchallenged, the more they harden into identity. Historically, hasty generalization has fueled discrimination and violence. Entire ethnic groups have been vilified because of isolated acts. Cultures have been labeled lazy or violent based on anecdotes. Policies have been built around imagined patterns. And once those generalizations are embedded in law or media, they become self-reinforcing. The individual disappears. The story wins. What makes this fallacy effective is its efficiency. It lets us form opinions fast, protect our biases, and explain the world without complexity. But what it offers in speed, it steals in truth. A single tree doesn't describe the forest. A single storm doesn't define the climate. And a single encounter, no matter how vivid, is still just one point in the pattern. The next time a claim starts with "they always" or "that group never," listen for the sample size. If the data comes from one voice, one clip, or one gut feeling, it's not insight, it's an echo. Appeal to novelty. A tech company unveils its latest gadget. No specs, no reviews, just 2 words in giant letters. Next gen. People line up to buy it anyway. Not because they know it's better, but because it's new, and that feels like enough. That's appeal to novelty, the assumption that something is superior just because it's recent, updated, or rebranded. It's not the presence of improvement that convinces, it's the implication that time alone guarantees progress. This fallacy works best in cultures obsessed with speed. If it's newer, it must be more efficient. If it replaces something old, it must be more accurate. If it breaks tradition, it must be more evolved. No one asks whether the new thing is better, they just assume the old thing was outdated by default. You see it in personal development trends. New diets, new habits, new productivity methods. One week it's cold plunges. Next week, dopamine detox. Last month's ideas are discarded, not because they failed, but because they're no longer fresh. Old becomes suspicious. New becomes gospel, even when the new idea is just an old one, rewrapped. In advertising, this fallacy is strategy. A cereal box says, now with added quinoa. No one asks if that improves the product. It sounds modern. That's enough. Fast fashion, software tools, digital platforms, all use the churn of novelty to imply superiority. Yesterday's model is automatically seen as inferior. The implication, keep up or fall behind. But when you look closer, what's changed? Often, just the packaging. The substance remains the same, or gets worse. In education, institutions rebrand traditional disciplines. Philosophy becomes critical thinking for innovation. Art becomes visual communication dynamics. The core is unchanged, but the modern language gives it instant credibility. Even in politics, ideas are dismissed as outdated before their logic is even examined, as if their age is a flaw, as if wisdom has an expiration date. The reason this fallacy sticks is psychological. New things promise control, a sense of momentum. They offer the illusion that we're progressing, improving, evolving, even when the changes are cosmetic or empty. And in a culture addicted to updates, standing still feels like falling behind. So we chase novelty for its own sake, not because it's better, but because being seen with the latest signals intelligence, relevance, status. But the new is not automatically better, and the old is not automatically broken. There's nothing wrong with innovation. The danger is when we treat time as a measure of truth, when recency becomes a substitute for reasoning. Progress requires examination. Not everything that moves forward deserves to. When the pitch leans too hard on how recent something is, step back from the timeline. Forget the launch date, the version number, the rebrand. Ask, what changed, and who benefits from that change? Sometimes the only thing that's truly new is the way they're selling the same old illusion. Ludic Fallacy. A hedge fund manager builds a risk model based on simulated market data. The model works beautifully in testing, but the moment it meets real-world volatility, human panic, cascading fear, geopolitical chaos, it fails. Not because the math was wrong, but because the game it was based on was too clean. That's the Ludic Fallacy, the mistake of applying structured, simplified models to complex, unpredictable systems. It's named after ludus, Latin for game, a fallacy of play rules applied to a world that doesn't follow them. In games, the boundaries are known, the dice are fair, the outcomes are measurable, but life doesn't play fair. Its variables aren't listed in the rulebook, and the game never stops to let you read the instructions. This fallacy happens when someone designs a perfect model of risk, but forgets that the real world doesn't play by models. You see it in economics. Forecasters build theories, assuming rational behavior. They forget that people aren't rational. They're anxious, tribal, reactive, and one unexpected event, a rumor, a tweet, a war, can collapse a system the model said was stable. The 2008 financial crash was full of models that proved mortgage-backed securities were safe. The simulations didn't include fraud. They didn't include panic. They didn't include reality. In medicine, Ludic Fallacy appears in lab results that don't translate to patients. A drug performs well under controlled conditions, but fails when given to a diverse population with unpredictable lifestyles and interactions. The model assumed perfect adherence. The real world brought chaos. In personal development, it looks like life hacks. A system promises to optimize your day, block scheduling, habit stacking, gamified to-do lists. It works on paper, but then your child gets sick. You get laid off. You burn out. The model didn't account for grief, fatigue, or interruption. This fallacy persists because structure is comforting. A system that explains the world, even falsely, is more attractive than no system at all. People want to believe risk can be managed like poker or behavior predicted like chess. But humans aren't cards, and the world isn't a board. The Ludic Fallacy encourages overconfidence, not in logic itself, but in the assumption that logic can contain everything. It flatters the mind and punishes the body when reality breaks the model. There's nothing wrong with structure. What matters is knowing where the structure ends. Smart systems know their limits. Bad ones pretend the world fits inside them. So when a claim is backed by a simulation, a game theory, a test environment, don't ask whether it works there. Ask what happens when it meets something messy, irrational, and alive. Ask what breaks when the game stops being a game. To QuoQue. A politician is caught breaking ethics rules. When confronted, they don't deny the wrongdoing. They deflect. What about my opponent? He's done worse. The accusation is never answered. The guilt is never addressed. The spotlight just swivels. This is to QuoQue, Latin for you too. It's the fallacy of responding to criticism by accusing the accuser of the same or similar faults. Not a defense, just an attempt to cancel the argument by turning it into a mirror. This move doesn't claim innocence, it just insists that everyone is dirty, so no one should be held accountable. It's a shortcut out of responsibility, designed to blur the moral line by dragging everyone into the mud. If the accuser is flawed, then their point becomes invalid. Also, the fallacy suggests. In politics, QuoQue is standard procedure. A leader exposed for corruption pivots. Well, the last administration did the same thing. The conversation shifts from what was done to who's worse, to the public loses interest in justice and gets trapped in tribal scoreboard logic. Everyone's wrong, so nothing changes. In debates about war, policy, or systemic harm, you'll hear it used to paralyze action. Country A is accused of atrocities. It replies, "And what about what you did in the past?" Suddenly the conversation isn't about the harm, it's about moral equivalence. History becomes a smokescreen. The original issue disappears into a fog of counter-accusation, and the truth collapses under the weight of distraction. You see it in personal arguments too. A partner says, "You've been distant lately." The reply, "And what about last month, when you shut me out?" It's not wrong, but it's not relevant to the moment. The fallacy hides in timing, burying one legitimate concern under another. What should be an opportunity for reflection becomes a contest of grievances. QuoQue and works because it feels like justice. If both sides are guilty, then calling out one feels hypocritical. But that's the trick. The fallacy relies on emotional fairness, not logical integrity. It weaponizes inconsistency, trying to dodge accountability. It also functions as a shield. Admitting guilt is hard, so people reach for counterexamples, not to clarify, but to escape. And once both sides are shown to be flawed, the argument dies of exhaustion. The public disengages. The audience shrugs. That's the quiet power of this fallacy. It doesn't prove anything. It just erodes urgency. The presence of hypocrisy doesn't make a claim false. If a smoker tells you smoking is dangerous, they might be a hypocrite, but the risk is still real. Truth doesn't need a perfect messenger, and failure to follow one's own advice doesn't invalidate the advice itself. What cuts through QuoQue is the ability to separate the message from the messenger, to evaluate claims on merit, not moral perfection. When someone brings up a counter wrong, you don't have to ignore it. Just don't let it bury the first. Two wrongs don't cancel each other. They double the need for clarity. Special pleading. A man insists everyone should follow the law, no exceptions, but when his own son is caught breaking it, he says, "Well, the situation is complicated. You have to understand the pressure he's under. The rules remain, they're just not for him." That's special pleading, the fallacy where someone applies a standard to others, but carves out an exception for themselves, their group or their beliefs. Not with justification, but with excuses. The rules are universal until they're inconvenient. This fallacy doesn't refute a principle. It accepts the principle, but demands exemption. It creates a double standard, one that hides behind emotion, loyalty, or unique circumstances. And it's always framed as reasonable. You see it in politics constantly. A leader enforces austerity, then funds luxury travel for themselves. The justification: my work is important, I need to stay sharp. The public is expected to tighten their belts. The elite claims to need a longer belt for the greater good. The rules haven't changed, they've just been bent for the chosen few. In religious or ideological movements, special pleading can become doctrine. A group preaches moral purity, but excuses its founders' abuse as misunderstood or out of context. If an outsider commits the same acts, they're condemned. If an insider does it, they're under spiritual attack, or more complex than critics understand. It's not about defending truth, it's about protecting the brand. In everyday life, the fallacy hides in defensiveness. A student who argues for strict grading standards asks for leniency when they miss a deadline. A parent who punishes lying tells their child, sometimes adults have to bend the truth. It's different. It isn't. but the person telling the story needs it to be. Special pleading often hides behind vague terms like context, nuance, or real-world complications. These are valid concepts, but when they're only used to excuse one side, they become camouflage. It's not nuance, it's selective mercy. This fallacy works because people view themselves as the exception. They know the rule exists for a reason. They just believe their motives, pressures, or background make them too unique to be held to it. And once you believe your story is exceptional, you start rewriting fairness around it. Others get judged by outcome. You get judged by intention. Others face consequences. You receive understanding. This fallacy spreads when systems reward loyalty over logic, when institutions protect insiders, when families minimize their own dysfunction, when movements shield their own from criticism. The principle becomes hollow, and the credibility collapses with it. A principle that only works when it's easy isn't a principle. It's a preference with armor, and a rule that bends every time it faces pressure was never a rule, just a suggestion for people with less power. Appeal to authority. A new diet trend explodes across social media, not because of clinical trials, not because of evidence, but because a celebrity said, "It changed my life." No credentials, no research, just influence. That's appeal to authority. A fallacy where a claim is accepted as true, not because of evidence, but because it's backed by someone with perceived power, status, or expertise, even if that expertise is irrelevant to the subject. The logic skips the idea entirely and leans on who said it. This fallacy doesn't always look like blind trust. It often hides in confident language. Well, Dr. Simmons said it's true. He's a professor. She's a CEO. The assumption is simple. If someone high up believes it, then I don't need to think about it. The higher the pedestal, the lower the scrutiny. In science, this fallacy shows up when theories are repeated because a famous researcher supports them even after new data contradicts the claim. Some fields cling to old models long past their expiration because challenging the authority behind them feels like heresy. In politics, it's used to silence dissent. A policy gets questioned. The defense? Well, the Prime Minister agrees. As if political rank makes an idea more rational. The argument never enters the room. The resume does. Appeal to authority isn't always dishonest. It often comes from intellectual exhaustion. Complex issues require time, comparison, background. Trusting an expert feels like an efficient shortcut. And when the expert is confident, people stop checking. But titles don't guarantee truth. Degrees don't prevent bias. And authority doesn't make an argument. It only delivers one. This fallacy becomes dangerous when the authority being cited isn't even relevant. A tech CEO offers medical advice. A Nobel laureate in physics comments on morality. A self-help author gives legal analysis. People conflate brilliance with universality. Assuming expertise in one field means authority in all fields. It flatters the speaker and seduces the listener. Marketing uses this fallacy shamelessly. A toothpaste is recommended by 9 out of 10 dentists. Which dentists? How was the question asked? What does recommend mean? It doesn't matter. The uniform matters. The white coat does the heavy lifting. In personal life, this fallacy appears when family members or mentors are treated as infallible. My father always said, "My coach used to tell me," the speaker may be wise, but their wisdom isn't proof. Even smart people believe dumb things, and even kind people give bad advice. This fallacy isn't an attack on expertise. It's a reminder that expertise must still be tested. A claim should stand on its own strength. Authority should open the door, not end the discussion. If someone invokes a name instead of a reason, ask what that person actually said and whether it holds up without the badge beside it. Reputation may carry a voice into the room, but reason keeps it there. Appeal to nature. A product label reads, 100% natural ingredients. No explanation, no evidence, just the word natural, standing in for trust. It doesn't say what those ingredients do, only that they came from nature. and that's supposed to be enough. This is the appeal to nature, the fallacy of assuming that something is good, right, or superior simply because it's natural. It's not an argument. It's a vibe, dressed up as logic. This fallacy trades on a romantic idea of nature, clean, pure, balanced. It ignores that nature also includes poison, disease, extinction. Rattlesnakes are natural, so is lead, so is malaria. And yet, when someone says something is natural, they often mean harmless or healthy. The implication slips in without being examined. In health and wellness culture, this fallacy is used constantly. Natural medicine is assumed to be safer, even if it's untested. Synthetic drugs, even with decades of evidence, are distrusted for being man-made. But nature doesn't design for human benefit. It just is. And what works in a plant or a fungus isn't automatically good for people. Evolution doesn't care about our health. It cares about survival. In food marketing, natural becomes a brand, not a category. A product is labeled natural, though it's filled with sugar or has no nutritional value. No regulations define the term clearly, but the word signals wholesomeness. Buyers feel reassured, not by science, but by aesthetic. This fallacy also infects moral reasoning. Arguments like homosexuality is unnatural or monogamy is natural show up in cultural debates. But nature contains everything, from asexual species to animals that change sex to same-sex pair bonding across species. To cherry-pick what's natural is to misunderstand how vast and indifferent the natural world really is. Nature doesn't set moral rules. It offers variety, not instruction. In technology and progress, the appeal to nature often hides in nostalgia. The old ways were better. We're too disconnected from nature. There's value in tradition, but this fallacy uses it as a shield against evidence. If natural childbirth is better, it's because of outcome, not because it's ancient. If unprocessed food is healthier, it's because of nutritional data, not because it hasn't been altered. Age doesn't prove virtue, and the forest doesn't vote on what's good. What makes this fallacy so persistent is how good it feels. It triggers a longing for simplicity, for clarity, for trust in something untouched. But simplicity is not always accurate, and untouched doesn't always mean safe. The smarter move is to treat natural as a description, not a justification. If a treatment is natural, ask if it's effective. If a behavior is natural, ask if it's ethical. If a process is artificial, ask if it works. Truth isn't grown, it's verified. The forest is beautiful, but it's not a moral compass. And not every cure has roots in the ground. Composition fallacy. A team of brilliant engineers builds a machine. Each part, the circuits, sensors, processors, is top of the line. But when assembled, the machine constantly malfunctions. Everything inside it is excellent, but the system as a whole isn't. That's the composition fallacy, assuming that what's true of the parts must also be true of the whole. It's a failure of scale, a kind of logical gravity, pulling assumptions upward where they don't belong. You see it often in group dynamics. A company hires the best marketers, designers, and analysts, then wonders why the team can't collaborate. Individually, they're stars. Together, they clash, duplicate work, or move in opposite directions. Talent doesn't guarantee synergy. Skill doesn't ensure alignment. But the assumption feels intuitive, sure. With every piece is strong, the whole must be stronger. Except systems aren't just collections, they're interactions. In science, this fallacy creates false expectations. Each atom in a material might be colorless, but the combined structure produces color. Water molecules aren't wet. Wetness emerges from many of them behaving together. The qualities we observe often emerge, not add up, and the mistake is assuming that if a trait isn't in the ingredient list, it can't be in the final dish. In public policy, the fallacy becomes a trap. A nation invests heavily in the best individual schools, but the education system as a whole still fails. Why? Because standardization, inequality, and resource gaps exist between them. The quality of individual schools doesn't fix systemic imbalance. Good units don't cancel out bad design. It creeps into moral and social arguments too. Everyone I know is kind, so society can't be cruel. Or the officers I've met are fair, so there's no problem with policing. Local truth is treated as universal proof, but the whole doesn't reflect only its best parts. It reflects their relationship and the weight of everything around them. In advertising, this fallacy is dressed as logic. This car is made from the best parts: German engine, Italian brakes, American steel. So it must be the best car, right? Not necessarily. A meal made of expensive ingredients still fails if they don't work together. A story full of impressive scenes still bores if it doesn't flow. Great parts do not guarantee a great whole, especially when they were never meant to fit. Psychologically, the fallacy is comforting. It tells us that if we take care of the details, the big picture will take care of itself. That if we surround ourselves with good people, nothing bad can happen. That if each component is pure, the system can't be corrupt. It's not always wrong, but it's a gamble because harmony doesn't emerge automatically. It takes more than quality, it takes design. So when something seems broken at the top, don't just check. If the parts are fine, ask how they connect, how they interact, what gets lost between the lines. Perfection in isolation doesn't build coherence, and good pieces don't always make a good whole. Division fallacy. A student hears that their university is prestigious, so they assume every professor must be brilliant, every class exceptional, every graduate successful. By the second semester, reality sets in. Some professors barely teach, some classmates cheat. The brand is respected, but the parts don't always live up to the whole. This is the division fallacy, the error of assuming that what's true of a group, system, or category must also be true of every individual part. It's the inverse of composition fallacy. Instead of moving truth upward, it forces it downward, squeezing individuals into the shape of the group. This fallacy thrives on assumptions. The company is elite, so every employee must be a genius. The country is corrupt, so every citizen must be dishonest. The generation is lazy, so every young person must be entitled. One label becomes a verdict, dragged from the collective and dropped onto the individual. In advertising, this fallacy gets used to create instant credibility. A supplement is used by Olympic athletes, so people assume every ingredient must be effective. Even if one does nothing, or even harms performance, the association with elite performance makes every piece look golden. That's the trick. You borrow reputation from the whole and apply it to every bolt, molecule, or person inside it. In debates, division fallacy often hides inside moral outrage. A protest turns violent. Suddenly, every participant is labeled a rioter. A political party is exposed for corruption, and now every voter, staffer, and volunteer is assumed to be complicit. But large systems include contradictions, and people inside them don't all move as one. Yet the fallacy persists, because simplification feels cleaner than complexity. You also see this logic in institutional trust. A medical journal has a strong reputation, so every study it publishes must be accurate. But peer review isn't infallible, and reputation doesn't transfer value to every entry. The name creates a halo, and the audience forgets that even within great systems, weak links exist. It shows up in bias too. Someone says, "I've never met a dishonest police officer," so they assume there aren't any. Or they hear that a city is dangerous, so every person from there must be reckless. The fallacy becomes a framework, one that replaces inquiry with identity. You don't need to learn about the part, because you think you already understand the whole. This fallacy gains strength in cultures obsessed with branding. If the institution looks good, the members are presumed worthy. If the ideology is admired, its followers are above criticism. If the nation is praised, its citizens are morally superior. The inverse is just as common. If the system is corrupt, its members must be tainted. If the group is unpopular, the individuals must be wrong. But systems aren't smooth surfaces. They contain variants, outliers, contradictions, And no label captures that, not fully. When you hear a claim about them, pause before applying it to her or him. If the whole seems clear, don't assume the parts match. Because individuals don't owe their character to the group, and no system speaks with one voice. Affirming the consequent. You walk into your kitchen and smell fresh coffee. You think, if someone made coffee, I'd smell it. I smell it, so someone must have made coffee. But when you look around, the pot is cold. Turns out, someone just spilled grounds on a hot stove. The scent was real. The conclusion wasn't. That's affirming the consequent. A fallacy, where someone reasons that because a certain result has occurred, the cause they expect must be the one behind it. It follows this structure. If A, then B. Bell happened. Therefore must have caused it. It sounds logical, but skips over the fact that Bell could come from many sources. You'll often find this in faulty crime logic. If he's guilty, his fingerprints would be at the scene. His fingerprints are there, so he must be guilty. But maybe he visited the place earlier. Maybe he was framed. Maybe he was there legally. Fingerprint, guilt. But the mind wants closure, so it grabs the neatest explanation. In science, the fallacy leads to oversimplification. If this chemical reaction produces heat, then heat proves the reaction occurred. So, if there's heat, we assume the reaction happened, even if another process could be responsible. Cause and effect don't run on rails. They branch, they intersect, and assuming one path proves the source is a leap, not a step. In relationships, it appears emotionally. If she loves me, she'll text me good night. She texted me, that means she loves me. But people text for all kinds of reasons. Routine, habit, guilt. It might be love, or it might not. But the conclusion doesn't follow from the outcome alone. You'll see it in courtrooms, where lawyers bend logic to create implication. If the accused committed the crime, they'd be nervous. She was nervous, therefore she's guilty. But nerves come from many sources, especially when someone's life is on the line. What looks like a sign is just a signal, and signals need context. This fallacy thrives in situations where people want certainty. If a good leader would oppose this bill, and she opposes it, she must be a good leader. But opposition doesn't prove virtue. Agreement with a good outcome doesn't confirm the character behind it. We project intent backward from results, and forget that coincidence, alignment, and chance can all mimic cause. The psychological comfort comes from the illusion of deduction. It feels like logic. You work from effect to cause. You build backward, but the steps are incomplete, and the trail can lead to many doors. A better approach is to pause when a conclusion feels too convenient. When someone says, if this outcome happened, then my explanation is proven. Ask what else could cause that outcome. Truth isn't just what fits, it's what holds up, even when compared to alternatives. Don't trust a cause just because it comes with the right results. The world's full of echoes, not all of them from where you think. Anecdotal fallacy. A man hears that smoking causes cancer. He shrugs. My grandfather smoked every day and lived to 97, and just like that, decades of research are dismissed, because one story felt stronger than thousands of data points. That's the anecdotal fallacy, the mistake of using a personal story or isolated experience to override broader evidence. The logic doesn't ask what's true for most. It asks what's true for me, or someone I know, and then turns that into proof. This fallacy thrives on emotional vividness. A headline about rising car theft doesn't move you, but your neighbor's stolen vehicle. That hits. Suddenly, it's a crisis, even if the actual crime rate is dropping. One story feels real, statistics feel distant. So when people make claims, they reach for what's memorable, not what's typical. You'll hear it in debates over public health. Vaccines are proven safe by millions of trials and doses, but someone knows a friend's cousin who got sick after the shot. Now that story outweighs every peer-reviewed study. It becomes the authority, not because it's valid, but because it's personal. Fear wears a human face. Data doesn't. In politics, the anecdotal fallacy is used to stir distrust. A politician argues against welfare. They cite a story of one person abusing the system. That story is repeated on news panels and campaign ads. Never mind that it's the exception, it becomes the symbol. The audience no longer thinks in numbers. They think in names and headlines. Narrative replaces trend. In personal arguments, the fallacy is weaponized through memory. I was bullied by someone from that group. I know how they are. Or my ex was manipulative. All their type. I like that. One relationship becomes a blueprint. One wound becomes a worldview. The pattern isn't real, but it feels earned. And once a story becomes identity, evidence struggles to break through. Marketers use this fallacy with intent. Instead of citing studies, they present testimonials, before and after photos, voiceovers that say, "It worked for me, it'll work for you." The product's actual performance doesn't matter. What matters is that it sounds convincing in one case. Because if it worked once, we want to believe it always will. Anecdotal fallacy isn't just about being wrong. It's about how easily the human mind substitutes story for scale. We remember events that are sharp, not events that are common. So when someone presents a rare exception, and it's wrapped in enough detail, it feels like a rule, and rules made of stories feel safe, even when they lead us off course. You don't have to ignore stories, but you do need to ask what they represent. Is this a pattern, or just a moment? Anecdotes can open your eyes, but they don't close the case. Appeal to emotion. A commercial shows a child coughing in a dimly lit hospital bed. Then a voice says, "Don't let this happen to someone you love. Donate today." No mention of how the donation helps. No explanation of impact, process, or outcome. Just the feeling. That's appeal to emotion. A fallacy where emotion is used to replace logic, hijacking the audience's response to force agreement or action. It doesn't argue. It tugs. This fallacy doesn't care if something makes sense. It only cares if you feel something strong enough to say yes. Fear, guilt, pity, pride, anger. Once those get triggered, the rational gatekeeping shuts down. Decisions move from head to gut. And arguments that couldn't survive scrutiny now feel undeniable. In politics, this tactic is everywhere. A candidate talks about immigration policy. Instead of citing economic data, they tell a story of a grieving mother whose child was killed. It's tragic, real, but it's also one story, selected to produce fear, not understanding. Policies are shaped, not by outcomes, but by the intensity of emotion they generate. Public debate becomes emotional theater. Facts become irrelevant as long as the right buttons are pushed. In personal life, the fallacy shows up as emotional pressure. "I can't believe you'd say that after everything I've done for you." It doesn't address the point. It just burdens you with guilt. The message isn't, "Here's why I'm right." It's "Here's why disagreeing with me makes you cruel." Appeal to emotion functions like a trap. Once you're inside, you're not arguing anymore. You're defending your character. In advertising, the fallacy is sharpened for conversion. A charity ad shows crying animals. A political campaign flashes images of war, hunger, national pride. A luxury brand surrounds its product with images of belonging, status, beauty, fad. The content of the product doesn't matter. You're not being asked to think, you're being steered. This fallacy persists because it's efficient. It bypasses reason, skips the work of persuasion, and heads straight for the limbic system. It activates the part of you that reacts, not the part that reflects. And once emotion becomes the basis for a decision, every counterpoint feels like an attack on your feeling, not your belief. So logic sounds cold, evidence sounds cruel, skepticism sounds heartless. There's nothing wrong with emotion, but when it takes the place of thought, not alongside it, the conversation ends. You can be moved, disturbed, inspired, and still ask, what's really being claimed? What's the actual argument beneath this wave of feeling? Because if the emotion is the whole pitch, there's probably something they don't want you to notice. Burden of proof fallacy. A man claims he can read minds. When challenged, he says, "Prove I can't." It sounds like a dare, but it's not a defense, it's a deflection. That's the burden of proof fallacy. When someone makes a claim and expects others to disprove it, instead of offering evidence themselves. In logic, the person making the claim is responsible for proving it, but this fallacy reverses that responsibility. It demands that skeptics do the work, while the claimant sits back and insists they're right until proven otherwise. It shows up in everyday arguments. If ghosts aren't real, then explain all the sightings. If this diet didn't work, why are there so many success stories? Instead of offering reasons, the speaker demands that doubt be disproven, as if belief is the default, and skepticism needs justification. But in reality, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, not the other way around. In media, this fallacy becomes a tactic. A headline might say, "Are microwaves slowly poisoning you?" There's no direct accusation, just the question. But the implication is loaded, and the burden is placed on the audience to prove otherwise. If the claim sticks, it doesn't matter if it's weak. It lives through the suspicion it creates. And suspicion doesn't need evidence, just repetition. In marketing, it's a quiet tool of persuasion. A supplement ad says, "No one has proven it doesn't work," or "These benefits haven't been disproven by science." The product offers testimonials, not studies. The burden is shifted to critics. You, the consumer, are challenged to disprove the effect, even though you never made a claim. It's a subtle form of psychological pressure. Doubt becomes framed as arrogance. Caution sounds like denial. Historically, this fallacy has been used to silence dissent. During witch trials, accused women were told to prove they weren't witches. No evidence of guilt was required, just fear, accusation, and the failure to prove innocence. The logic was backward and fatal. The assumption of guilt became the default, and in that inversion, justice collapsed. In political debate, it works the same way. A policy is criticized. The defenders say, "Can you prove it won't work?" But that's not how policy should be defended. Proposing change requires justification. Doubt isn't sabotage, it's a demand for clarity. This fallacy shifts the ground beneath the discussion. Now the skeptic becomes the one on trial. What makes this fallacy persuasive is that it feels like confidence. People who shift the burden sound sure of themselves. They act like they don't need proof because they're so obviously right. But that's performance, not reasoning. When someone makes a claim, they carry the weight. If they want it believed, they need to lift it. And if they hand you that burden instead, you don't have to carry it just to be polite. No true Scotsman. A claim doesn't become more valid just because someone shouts, "Well, prove me wrong." That moment, the challenge, the posture, the reversal, is where burden of proof fallacy takes root. This fallacy happens when someone makes a claim, but instead of providing evidence, they demand that others disprove it. The burden, the responsibility to prove, is shifted away from the person making the statement and thrown at anyone who questions it. It flips the rules of reason. Suddenly, doubt is treated as the thing that must be justified. You'll hear it casually in conversations. "Aliens built the pyramids. Can you prove they didn't?" Or, "I just feel this product works. Unless you've got proof, it doesn't." In both cases, the claim stands not on support, but on the absence of refutation. It's a house of cards, with a sign that says, "Unless you knock it down, it must be real." But logic doesn't work that way. If someone asserts something, they're the one who needs to show their work. This fallacy is especially common when the topic is complex: science, politics, medicine. The person making the claim avoids the hard part, offering evidence, and shifts the conversation into an endless loop of defense. Now the critic is playing catch-up, swatting away shadows. That structure isn't accidental. It's designed to stall the conversation and exhaust the challenger. In courtrooms, burden of proof is the foundation. The prosecution must prove guilt. The defense doesn't have to prove innocence, because that's not how justice works. But when public opinion becomes the courtroom, people flip the principle A person accused of misconduct is told to prove they didn't mean it that way, or prove they're not lying. In these moments, the burden silently migrates, and what was once a standard of fairness becomes a game of pressure. Advertising plays with this fallacy constantly, though more subtly. A supplement might boast clinically unproven to cause harm. The implication is that it's safe, but no evidence of safety is offered, only the absence of disproof. Another ad might say, many users report success, no one's shown it doesn't work. The consumer is now holding the burden. The claim survives not because it was supported, but because it wasn't attacked hard enough. This fallacy can even show up in close relationships. I know you're mad at me. Don't deny it, just admit it. The person is forced to defend themselves from a claim they never made. The original assertion requires no evidence, only pressure. Over time, this erodes trust, because it changes the terms of dialogue. You must prove your intentions, or I'll treat my assumptions as fact. That's not communication. That's a quiet form of control. Historically, the burden of proof fallacy has justified countless injustices. In medieval witch trials, women were told to prove they weren't witches. No evidence of guilt was necessary, only the suspicion. The failure to prove innocence was taken as proof of guilt. In politics, dissenters are often expected to disprove the regime's righteousness. If they can't, they're branded traitors. Authoritarian systems lean on this fallacy to silence criticism, because it's easier to accuse than to explain. The fallacy lingers because it feels strong. When someone says, "Prove me wrong," it sounds bold, confident, unshakable. But it's not strength, it's avoidance. It puts the weight on the skeptic, while the claimant offers nothing but noise. The correction is simple. You don't argue louder. You return the burden to where it belongs. I don't need to disprove your claim. If you want it believed, you'll need to prove it. That isn't evasion. It's how reasoning protects itself. Because in any honest conversation, belief comes after the burden, not before it. Ambiguity Fallacy. A company promises their product is clinically tested. Tested for what? By whom? With what results? The words look official, almost scientific, but the meaning is loose, flexible, ambiguous enough to impress, without saying anything concrete. This is the ambiguity fallacy, when a word, phrase, or concept is used in a vague or shifting way, allowing the speaker to make a claim that sounds solid but collapses under scrutiny. It's not a lie, it's a fog, a way of speaking that slides between meanings, often without the audience noticing the shift. It works because language is imperfect. Words carry emotional weight, cultural baggage, and multiple definitions. When those definitions blur together, precision vanishes, and the space left behind gets filled by assumption. Take the word freedom. One person hears freedom from oppression. Another hears freedom from taxes. A politician uses the word deliberately, knowing each group will hear what they want. The speech inspires, rallies, mobilizes. But what exactly was promised? Nothing, just a glow. In courtrooms, ambiguity becomes a tool of manipulation. A lawyer says the accused had contact with the victim. It could mean a conversation. It could mean a confrontation. It could mean nothing. If the jury doesn't ask for clarity, the word works like magic, planting the idea of guilt without having to prove it. In contract law, a clause that says a party must act within a reasonable time creates fertile ground for dispute. What's reasonable, to whom, and under what conditions? Ambiguity doesn't just confuse, it creates leverage. In personal arguments, it's a subtle weapon. You said you'd be honest. I am being honest, but one person means full transparency, while the other means simply not lying. The same word, different realities. And when expectations clash, the speaker can retreat. I never said that. They didn't, because they never said anything clearly. In advertising, ambiguity is a strategy, not a mistake. A product is labeled natural, or doctor recommended, or supports heart health. Each phrase sounds meaningful. None are defined. No one knows what's being claimed, but everyone feels reassured. And that's the point. It creates the illusion of substance, without the risk of being pinned down. Politicians rely on it when promising change. They say they'll protect values, or stand up for working families, or invest in our future. These statements are structurally hollow, but emotionally full. They allow the speaker to avoid detail and avoid accountability later, because if pressed, they can always say, "That's not what I meant." Historically, ambiguity has been used to justify violence and oppression. During wartime, governments redefine terms like enemy combatant, security threat, or preemptive defense to include almost anything. Words lose their edges, and when definitions are slippery, so is morality. Ambiguity provides plausible deniability. It gives power the space to act without having to say what it's doing. The fallacy survives because people don't like to stop and ask, "What do you mean by that?" It feels awkward, confrontational. But without that question, ambiguity wins. And once meaning becomes a moving target, logic has no place to land. The way through isn't to demand perfection from language. It's to demand clarity where clarity matters. If a claim depends on a word with many meanings, ask which one is being used. If a promise feels too smooth, test the edges. Because when words mean everything, they end up meaning nothing. Affirming the disjunct. A parent tells their child, "You can have cake or ice cream." The child chooses cake, then assumes that means they can't have ice cream. But the parent never said the options were exclusive, only that both were on the table. This mistake, reading one choice as eliminating all others, is at the heart of affirming the disjunct. It's a formal fallacy that happens when someone assumes that if one possibility is true, the others must be false, even when the statement itself never required a forced choice. It usually sounds like logic, but it's logic misapplied, based on a misunderstanding of how OR works. In formal logic, there are two types of OR. Exclusive, either A or B, but not both. Inclusive, A or B, or both. Most real-world situations use the inclusive version. But when someone treats every OR as a mutually exclusive either-or, reasoning derails. In criminal law, you sometimes hear this when a suspect's alibi is partially confirmed. If he was at the gas station, he couldn't have been at the scene. But what if the crime spanned time? What if both things could be true? Affirming one fact doesn't eliminate others, unless the structure demands it. But in fast-paced argument, people often impose false dichotomies for convenience. In personal relationships, it can show up in emotional logic. If you love your job, you must not love me. Or you supported her idea, so you must be against mine. Here, emotional disjuncts are fabricated, as if support, care, or belief must be a zero-sum game. But life rarely operates in mutually exclusive lanes. Affirming one value doesn't erase the others, unless you're determined to see things that way. In marketing, this fallacy is used to steer consumer identity. A brand might suggest, "You're either with us, or you're outdated. You wear this style, or you don't belong. You use our software, or you're behind." The goal isn't argument, it's framing. By affirming one disjunct, they imply that all others are obsolete, undesirable, or unworthy. It's not just a product pitch, it's a boundary drawn around identity. In politics, this fallacy becomes a wedge. A voter supports a tax cut, so critics say, "Then you must be against the poor," or someone supports environmental regulation, and it's reframed as, "So you're anti-business." It isn't enough to engage with the position. The fallacy works by flattening complexity. You're either this or that, one side or the other, nothing in between. This isn't just intellectually lazy, it's deliberate. It streamlines messaging, eliminates nuance, and simplifies enemies. Media narratives often follow this logic. A public figure is critical of one nation's policy, and headlines frame it as opposition to the entire country. Or, a person advocates for secular law, and they're accused of being anti-faith. It's the disjunct reframed to accuse. One option is affirmed, so all others are cast aside, or cast as hostile. Why does this fallacy resonate? Because binary thinking is cognitively easy. It demands less processing. You're for or against, in or out. With us or them. The space between gets erased, and once it's gone, nuance feels like betrayal. Saying both or it depends becomes suspect. The fix is recognizing that most choices aren't battles, and most alternatives don't cancel each other. Options can coexist. Truth can come in pairs, and arguments can hold multiple valid threads at once. When someone affirms one side of a disjunct, ask whether the statement ever required exclusion, because often the fallacy isn't in what was said, but in the narrowness of how it's heard. Appeal to tradition. A ceremony is performed every year. No one knows exactly why, not even the organizers, but it's repeated without question, because it's always been done. And that's supposed to be enough. That's the core of the appeal to tradition, the fallacy of assuming that something must be right, good, or better, simply because it's been done that way in the past. It's not logic, it's nostalgia, disguised as authority. The appeal works by taking age and dressing it up as wisdom. It treats survival as proof of virtue. If a belief lasted a long time, it must be valid. If a method endured for generations, it must be the best. If a rule has always been in place, there must be a reason, even if that reason is never examined. In politics, this fallacy is a default defense. A system is questioned, the response is immediate. That's how we've always done it. Gerrymandering. Electoral college systems. Obsolete laws. Instead of evaluating outcomes, defenders invoke history. The idea is simple. If something has roots, don't dig them up, even if they're strangling the garden. But time doesn't guarantee truth. It guarantees survival. And sometimes, bad ideas survive for reasons that have nothing to do with merit, inertia, fear, ritual, control. You'll find it in family dynamics too. Rules are enforced with lines like, "That's how I was raised." No further explanation. The past becomes the template. No matter how dysfunctional it was, tradition becomes a shield, a way to avoid reflection, apology, or adaptation. It tells us that how things were is how things should be, even if how things were caused harm. In religious and cultural practices, this fallacy can preserve both beauty and harm. Some traditions connect people, offer stability, and carry wisdom, but others perpetuate oppression, exclusion, or superstition. And when challenged, defenders often don't argue, they assert, "It's our tradition." It ends the conversation by appealing to origin, not outcome. In advertising, the fallacy is used to build brand loyalty. Family-owned since 1894, crafted the old-fashioned way. The implication is that longevity equals quality. It might, but it might also mean nothing more than good marketing. Tradition becomes shorthand for trust, even when the product has changed entirely. It sells the past to anchor the present. History is full of breakthroughs that required abandoning tradition. Galileo challenged geocentrism and was condemned for violating centuries of accepted belief. Women entering universities were once dismissed because education is a man's role. Every social reform, from civil rights to labor laws, confronted systems that were defended with, "That's how it's always been." Appeal to tradition resists change, not by proving the past right, but by making change feel dangerous. It treats reform as betrayal. The fallacy works because tradition offers comfort. It provides identity, rhythm, and meaning. And those things matter, but clinging to them, uncritically, can make us blind to better ways, or to harm done, in the name of continuity. The question to ask isn't, "How long has this been done?" It's, "Does it still serve us? Does it still hold up? Does it need to?" Time is not a test of truth. It's only a record of repetition, and the past is not a justification. It's a starting point, not a verdict. Genetic fallacy. A theory is proposed. It's compelling, well supported, and carefully argued. Then someone shrugs and says, "Well, the guy who came up with it was kind of a crackpot." No discussion of the evidence, no critique of the reasoning, just a dismissal based on the source. That's the genetic fallacy, when an idea is accepted or rejected solely because of where it comes from, not because of what it says. It focuses on origin, not merit. If the source is considered bad, the argument must be bad. If the source is trusted, the claim must be true. The content itself is ignored. You see this fallacy in politics constantly. A bill is proposed. Instead of debating its details, opponents say, that came from the other party. That's all you need to know. But who wrote a policy doesn't determine whether it works. What matters is what it actually does. This fallacy keeps people locked in tribal thinking. Ideas aren't evaluated. They're judged by loyalty, brand, and bloodline. It happens in science too. If a new hypothesis is introduced, but the author has a controversial past, many will reject the work outright, regardless of whether the data holds. Peer review is meant to protect against bias, but the genetic fallacy bypasses data entirely, reducing inquiry to character judgment. History is full of moments where truth was buried because of this fallacy. During the Cold War, American researchers often dismissed scientific findings from the Soviet Union, not on scientific grounds, but because of political origin. Meanwhile, Soviet officials rejected Western advances in medicine for the same reason. Lives were lost, because the ideas were seen as tainted, regardless of validity. The badge on the uniform mattered more than the content of the report. In the courtroom, this fallacy becomes a tool of prosecution. A witness is discredited, not for what they say, but for who they are. Their background, occupation, or past mistakes become the reason to ignore their current statement, even if it's verifiable. Reputation overshadows substance, and while skepticism of a source is reasonable, dismissing the argument because of the source is not. You'll see it in social media, where origin is everything. Someone shares an article. A reply immediately notes where it was published. The headline is never read. The argument is never addressed. The platform, the logo, or the person who posted it becomes the argument. Everything else becomes irrelevant. In personal life, the fallacy emerges in quieter forms. A parent hears advice from a childless friend and thinks, they don't have kids, they can't possibly understand. But insight isn't always tied to personal history. Sometimes, it comes from observation, sometimes, from empathy, and sometimes, yes, even from outsiders. The assumption that wisdom must come from lived similarity blocks learning. In advertising and branding, this fallacy is often inverted. A claim is trusted because it comes from a celebrity, not because they know anything about the subject, but because of who they are. Fame becomes evidence. Association becomes argument, but that's just the same fallacy, flipped. To avoid it, don't ignore where an idea comes from, but don't let origin do the heavy lifting. Evaluate what's being said, not just who said it. Even bad people can say true things. Even corrupt systems can produce good outcomes. Even the discredited can sometimes be correct, and even the noble can be wrong. When a claim walks into the room, don't ask where it was born. Ask if it stands up once it's here. Sunk cost fallacy. A man sits through a 3-hour movie he's hating. At the halfway point, he says, well, I've already watched 90 minutes. Might as well finish it. He's not enjoying it. He's not gaining anything. He's just afraid that walking away would make those 90 minutes feel wasted. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the irrational commitment to keep investing time, money, or energy into something just because you've already put a lot into it. It's a decision driven not by potential value, but by past loss. The logic feels compelling. If I stop now, it was all for nothing. But that thinking locks people into failing projects, toxic relationships, broken policies, and exhausting obligations, because the more they've paid, the harder it is to admit it was the wrong purchase. In business, the fallacy costs millions. A company invests heavily in a product. It doesn't sell, but instead of cutting losses, they pour more into marketing, development, redesign. Why? Because pulling out would feel like admitting failure, even though staying in is burning more cash. The longer it runs, the harder it is to stop. What began as strategy becomes obsession. Money spent is treated like evidence of value, not a cost already gone. In war, the fallacy becomes tragedy. Leaders justify continued conflict by invoking sacrifice. We've already lost so many. We can't back down now. But loss doesn't justify more loss. It demands re-evaluation. Vietnam. Afghanistan, countless historical echoes. Nations stay committed to failing strategies because retreat feels like betrayal of time, of effort, of lives. So they double down, and the exit grows harder. In relationships, it traps people in unhappiness. Someone stays in a failing marriage because we've been together 10 years. They remain in a job they hate because I've already put so much into this company. The sunk time makes them feel bound, even when nothing is improving, and every day adds to the loss. The logic isn't growth, it's inertia, and the fear of regret. You see it in politics when leaders refuse to pivot. A program is failing, a policy isn't working, but the message becomes, we've committed too much to change course now. The idea is that changing direction shows weakness, but refusing to reassess only guarantees further decline. This isn't principle, it's ego stitched to the past. Even in education or hobbies, the fallacy creeps in. Someone spends years pursuing a degree they no longer care about, or sticks with a failing startup because of all the hours already sunk. Instead of asking, is this still right? They ask, wouldn't it be a waste if I quit now? That question traps them in a future dictated by a past they no longer believe in. Why does the fallacy work so well? Because humans are loss averse. We hate waste, we fear regret, and we mistake quitting for failure, when sometimes quitting is the most logical move. The fallacy builds a prison out of pride, and people sit in it to avoid the pain of admitting the door's been open the whole time. The way out is not to ignore the past, but to refuse to let it dictate the future. What's spent is spent. What matters is what remains, and whether continuing brings value or just prolongs the loss. It's not weakness to walk away from a bad bet. It's wisdom, and the cost already paid is not a reason to stay. It's the reason to think clearly now. Appeal to ignorance. A friend says, no one's ever proven aliens aren't visiting Earth. Then he leans back, satisfied, as if that settles it. But all he said is that there's no conclusive evidence against the idea, and in his mind, that makes the idea true. That's the appeal to ignorance. The fallacy of claiming something must be true because it hasn't been proven false, or false because it hasn't been proven true. It treats a lack of evidence as a kind of evidence, but absence of proof is not proof of anything. It's just absence. This fallacy operates in the gaps, and the bigger the unknown, the easier it becomes to fill it with whatever belief feels most comfortable, exciting, or emotionally convenient. If science hasn't explained consciousness, then it must be something supernatural. If no one can disprove the afterlife, then it must exist. If there's no hard proof this politician broke the law, then he must be innocent. In each case, the conclusion stands not on support, but on silence. You see it used to justify pseudoscience all the time. A health product claims, there are no studies saying this doesn't work. That line sounds persuasive, but it doesn't mean the product does work. It means no one has tested it, or that the company hasn't published results. The burden of proof has been flipped, and now skepticism is treated like cynicism. Consumers are nudged into believing, not because of what's known, but because of what hasn't been ruled out. In courtrooms, the burden of proof is sacred, innocent until proven guilty. But outside the legal system, the public often reverses it. If you can't prove you didn't do it, you must be guilty. Or if there's no evidence of abuse, then it probably didn't happen. Here, ignorance is weaponized. Uncertainty becomes a void that people rush to fill, not with careful thought, but with whatever suits their bias. This fallacy also feeds conspiracy theories. There's no solid proof this didn't happen, so maybe it did. The government hasn't debunked this. What are they hiding? The less evidence exists, the more mysterious it seems, and the more that mystery is mistaken for plausibility. But not knowing something doesn't make the wildest explanation more likely. It just makes space for belief. In religious and philosophical debate, the fallacy is more subtle. If you can't disprove the soul, then you have to admit it might be real. If no one knows why we're here, then my theory is just as valid as any. But not all explanations are equal. Some are built on logic and observable data, others are built on gaps, guesses, or emotional appeal. Treating all unknowns as open fields is comforting, but it ignores the reality that not every idea deserves equal weight, just because we're uncertain. Why does this fallacy work? Because humans are uncomfortable with "I don't know." Uncertainty feels like weakness. And so, in the silence left by incomplete knowledge, we tend to build conclusions, not out of truth, but out of desire. And when no one can refute us, we take that as validation. But that's not logic. That's projection. Appeal to ignorance is subtle because it often sounds reasonable. It hides in phrases like, "what if," or "you can't prove otherwise." But those aren't arguments, they're placeholders. And when someone refuses to support their claim, and instead demands you disprove it, you're not in a conversation. You're in a maze with no exit. The answer to uncertainty isn't to pretend the first explanation is true. It's to stay with the unknown until better evidence appears. There's no shame in saying, "we don't know yet." The mistake is pretending that means anything can go. Appeal to the stone. Someone points out a flaw in a social system. Their friend shrugs and says, "That's ridiculous." No reasoning, no counterpoint, just rejection by tone. This is appeal to the stone, a fallacy where an argument is dismissed outright as absurd, impossible, or unworthy of discussion, without providing any reason why. It's not rebuttal, it's dismissal. Named after the 18th century philosopher Samuel Johnson, who, when told reality might not exist outside the mind, kicked a stone and said, "I refute it thus." The fallacy wasn't the kick, it was the refusal to engage. A gesture pretending to be a counter-argument. This fallacy shows up in everyday conversations. I think modern education is failing students. "Oh, come on, that's nonsense." And the conversation ends. No one has to explore the idea, because the idea has already been laughed out of the room. Dismissal becomes a substitute for reasoning, and the more confident the dismissal sounds, the more effective it is at shutting people down. In politics, it becomes a weapon of control. A policy suggestion is labeled unrealistic or extreme, not with evidence, but with tone. A proposal to reform prisons, restructure the economy, or rethink healthcare is brushed off as idealism or fantasy. No analysis, just the insistence that it can't be serious, so it doesn't deserve attention. And because people often fear looking naive, they hesitate to defend the idea. The fallacy works by shaming curiosity. In science, the fallacy has delayed breakthroughs. When Ignaz Semmelweis proposed hand-washing to reduce infections, his colleagues ridiculed the idea. There was no formal disproof, just incredulity. It sounded wrong. Years passed, countless died. Not because the idea was tested and rejected, but because it was never given the dignity of a test. Appeal to the stone doesn't attack an idea. It acts like the idea never existed. Socially, it becomes a tool for maintaining norms. A person questions a tradition, belief, or custom. The reply is swift. "That's just stupid." Even if the tradition causes harm, even if the belief is outdated, the dismissiveness is used to protect comfort, not truth. No one has to change. They just have to laugh louder. Online, this fallacy is everywhere. Someone posts a nuanced perspective. Another replies, "This is peak delusion." The post gets ratioed, mocked, or quote-tweeted into silence. No argument is made. The community simply agrees that this isn't even worth thinking about. And once an idea is framed as ridiculous, most people won't risk being seen defending it. Why does it work? Because it's fast. It relieves the burden of thought. It feels strong, firm, grounded, confident, without the need for substance. People like certainty. And when someone acts certain while refusing to explain, it feels like wisdom. But real thought doesn't start with "that's ridiculous." It starts with "why do you think that?" To appeal to the stone is powerful, not because it wins arguments, but because it stops them from happening. It makes people back away, feel embarrassed, shut down. That's why it's used. Not to clarify truth, but to silence questions. When you see this move, when someone swats an idea away like it's beneath them, you don't need to argue louder. You just need to recognize the silence beneath the noise. No evidence, no logic, just the sound of a stone hitting the ground, pretending to speak. Continuum fallacy. A person claims they were harassed. Someone replies, "Was it really harassment, or was it just a rude comment?" Then adds, "There's a spectrum, not everything is black and white." The argument isn't that the behavior was acceptable. It's that, because the line is blurry, there must be no line at all. That's the continuum fallacy, rejecting a claim because it's difficult to draw a clear boundary. It assumes that if a distinction can't be precisely defined, it must not exist. That without perfect clarity, there's no difference worth recognizing. This fallacy plays well in conversations where absolutes are hard to come by. Ethics, behavior, responsibility, harm. If there's no clear point where childhood ends, then adulthood is just a myth. If we can't agree exactly when life begins, then no position on abortion is valid. If we can't say exactly how much inequality is too much, then maybe none of it is a problem. Uncertainty is weaponized. Precision becomes a requirement for belief, and in the process, truth becomes hostage to ambiguity. In science, this fallacy can distort public understanding. Climate change denial often leans on it. Temperatures fluctuate naturally. Where's the exact point where it becomes human-caused? But complex systems rarely offer clean dividing lines. The absence of a single threshold doesn't erase the trend. Tobacco companies use similar tactics. You can't prove the exact cigarette that caused the cancer. So they argued, for decades, that causality was unclear. Even as bodies piled up, it wasn't about evidence. It was about demanding precision, where uncertainty was inevitable. In political discourse, continuum fallacy is used to stall reform. Someone calls for police accountability. A reply comes back, "Well, not every officer is abusive," or "How do you define systemic?" Instead of engaging with the claim, the responder shifts to demanding perfect categorization, and in doing so, avoids the uncomfortable work of moral recognition. The tactic is elegant. If the spectrum is broad, pretend the extremes don't exist. In personal relationships, this fallacy silences confrontation. A partner says, "You've been dismissive lately." The response, "What does dismissive even mean?" "I don't yell. I don't insult." Now the issue isn't the pattern, it's the lack of a perfect label, and the conflict dissolves into linguistic debate, rather than emotional accountability. This fallacy also serves as a defense mechanism in social ethics. Sure, that joke was offensive to some people, but where do we draw the line? What's next? Banning everything? When clarity is difficult, the continuum fallacy suggests that standards are impossible, and therefore unreasonable. But just because lines are blurry, doesn't mean there are no boundaries at all. Why does this fallacy resonate? Because it gives cover. It allows people to avoid action by hiding behind gray zones. It pretends complexity is paralysis, that if we can't define something perfectly, we shouldn't act on it at all. But life doesn't wait for clean definitions. Justice doesn't require a ruler. Harm can be real, even if it's hard to measure. Recognizing this fallacy isn't about rejecting nuance. It's about not letting ambiguity become a license for inaction. We draw boundaries all the time, not because they're flawless, but because imperfect lines are still better than none at all. Equivocation. A headline reads, "Local mayor caught in public scandal." Click through, and you find out he received a parking ticket. Technically true, but not what anyone thought. The word scandal meant one thing on the surface, and something entirely different in context. That's equivocation, a fallacy that manipulates language by using a word in two or more senses within the same argument, creating the illusion of logic where none exists. It doesn't lie outright. It bends meaning just enough to mislead. Equivocation works by exploiting the flexibility of language. Words are rarely fixed. They have multiple definitions, tones, histories, and when someone slides between meanings mid-argument, they can make nonsense sound airtight. If all laws are meant to bring order, and natural laws exist, then nature must be governed by moral law. Here, law starts as a legal construct and ends as a scientific principle, but the audience may not notice the switch. The reasoning feels smooth. Contender conclusion feels earned, but it rests entirely on a hidden pivot. In legal rhetoric, equivocation has been used to twist testimony. A witness says they saw an incident. Later, it turns out they meant they heard about it, not that they observed it. The word saw is never clarified. The damage is already done. Lawyers know that juries remember what sounds powerful, not always what's precise. In religious and philosophical debate, equivocation often sneaks into definitions. The universe has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Therefore, the universe must have a personal creator. But what does cause mean here? Is it physical, temporal, moral? Is it the same kind of cause that applies to human decisions or to quantum events? The word seems consistent, but under the surface, it drifts. And the entire argument rides on that drift, staying unnoticed. In advertising, equivocation is standard practice. A food label says, "Help support immune health." Support isn't defined. Does it prevent illness? Cure it? Enhance it? The word has no measurable content, but carries emotional weight, or a brand says their product is natural. Natural, as in grown in the ground, or natural, as in technically not synthetic. The vagueness is the feature, not the bug. In personal conflict, equivocation helps people dodge accountability. You said you'd be honest with me. I am honest. I just didn't mention it. Here, honest shifts from full disclosure to just not lying, and suddenly, trust breaks. Not because of what was said, but because of how a word was stretched. Equivocation gives cover. It turns shared language into a private loophole. This fallacy can also serve as a subtle power move. In debates, it allows someone to appear intellectually sharp while staying slippery. They use academic language that shifts meaning just enough to avoid being pinned down, and when pressed, they say, "You misunderstood." But it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a strategy using words like smoke. Why does it work? Because people don't dissect every sentence they hear. They follow rhythm, tone, confidence. If a word sounds consistent, they assume it is, and equivocation thrives in that space between assumed meaning and actual intent. Spotting this fallacy isn't about nitpicking language. It's about holding words still long enough to see if they're being moved behind your back. Ask, is the word being used in the same way throughout the argument? Or has it quietly changed clothes? Because if the logic hinges on a shifting definition, it's not logic, it's misdirection dressed in vocabulary. Faulty analogy. A politician says, "Running a country is like running a business. You wouldn't hire someone with no financial experience to manage your company." It sounds clean, familiar, sensible, but it's broken from the start. Running a business isn't like governing a country. A company can fire unprofitable customers. A government can't. A company optimizes for profit. A government juggles justice, infrastructure, rights, and long-term stability. A analogy is neat and completely hollow. That's faulty analogy. When an argument relies on a comparison that glosses over the critical differences between two things, it's not always malicious. In fact, it's often compelling because it feels helpful. Analogies give abstract issues emotional weight. They simplify, but in that simplification, they quietly mislead. You see it in ethical debates. Abortion is like murder, taxation is theft, using AI is like playing God. Each of these collapses wildly complex systems into a provocative label. They don't illuminate the issue. They shortcut the reasoning. The problem isn't that analogies are wrong, it's that they're unexamined. The speaker gets credit for clarity without being forced to explain the mechanics. Why is it like murder? What makes taxation like theft? What exactly is divine about computation? The fallacy thrives because people don't slow down to ask. They absorb the image, nod, and move on. It also appears in personal arguments. Why are you upset? If I did that to you, you'd laugh. As if emotional response is transferable, like a math formula. But people aren't interchangeable. Context matters. History matters. Power dynamics matter. The analogy flattens all of that. And in marketing, this fallacy becomes a tool of desire. This protein powder is like having a personal trainer in a bottle. This app is like therapy without the cost. The analogy gives you a feeling, not a fact. It trades precision for persuasion. So how do you guard against it? When you hear a comparison, ask what's actually being compared here, and are the parts that matter truly alike? Where the analogy breaks is often where the truth begins, because if the likeness is only skin deep, the argument has no bones. Denying the antecedent. A friend tells you, if it rains, the streets will be wet, then looks outside and says, well, it's not raining, so the streets must be dry. But it rained earlier, or maybe a street cleaner passed by. Maybe there was a broken pipe. The logic collapses the moment you realize, just because one cause didn't happen, doesn't mean the effect didn't. That's denying the antecedent, a formal fallacy that assumes if a conditional, if A then B is true, then if not A then not B must also be true. But that's never guaranteed. Not in logic, not in life. This fallacy pretends to know everything about causality from just one link. It assumes a world where only one condition can create a result, and if that condition is missing, the result becomes impossible. If I don't go to the gym, I won't lose weight. But weight loss can happen from diet, stress, illness, or other activity. The person treats a helpful condition as an exclusive one, and the rest of the possibilities vanish from view. In software logic, this fallacy leads to brittle systems. A developer writes, if user is admin, then show admin panel, then assumes, if user is not admin, they won't access sensitive data. But that's not guaranteed. There may be side doors, bugs, other roles. Security by assumption breaks under complexity. The code looks fine, but the logic behind it is flawed. In public policy, the fallacy can mislead entire campaigns. If someone has no criminal record, then they're not a threat. Then, the inverse becomes assumed. If they do have a record, they must be dangerous. This flips logic backward and turns a conditional statement into a sweeping judgment. The fallacy can hide prejudice behind formal structure. In relationships, it appears as cold reasoning. If I don't forget our anniversary, then you'll be happy. So, when the anniversary is remembered and things still go wrong, the person is confused. They treated a single action as a guarantee and assumed that without it, nothing else mattered. But happiness doesn't hinge on one variable, and neither do most outcomes in human behavior. In ethics and law, the mistake can be more dangerous. If a person is guilty, they'll lie. The assumption becomes, if they're not lying, they must be innocent. But innocence doesn't always bring confidence, and guilt doesn't always come with deceit. Humans aren't programs. They behave unpredictably under stress, fear, shame, or trauma. This fallacy survives because it feels symmetrical. If A causes B, then without A, B shouldn't happen. It satisfies the mind's hunger for neat patterns. But real life doesn't work in only one direction. Most outcomes have multiple causes, and the absence of one condition says nothing certain about the presence or absence of the result. To spot denying the antecedent, look at how conclusions are built. Are they based on what must follow, or on what could still happen? If the logic says, if X, then Y, not X, therefore not Y. Pause. That's not logic. That's a shortcut, dressed in symmetry. The truth is, even when the first domino stays standing, others can still fall. Definist Fallacy. A politician stands on a debate stage and says, real freedom means never paying taxes. The audience cheers. But something subtle just happened. And it wasn't a policy argument. It was a redefinition. He didn't prove that freedom and taxes are incompatible. He simply declared it, shifted the meaning, and moved on like it was self-evident. That's the Definist Fallacy, a subtle but powerful error where someone redefines a complex concept in a way that suits their argument, then uses that manipulated definition as if it were universal truth. It's not analysis. It's rhetorical sleight of hand, pulling the word apart, replacing it, and pretending nothing changed. You see it in moral debates constantly. A commentator says, murder is always wrong. Abortion is murder. Therefore, abortion is wrong. But murder is being redefined mid-argument. It's a legal term, deliberate, unlawful killing, not just any form of ending life. By sneaking a new definition into an emotionally loaded word, the argument bypasses nuance. And once the definition is twisted, the conclusion becomes inevitable, even if it rests on fiction. In public policy, the fallacy can reframe entire movements. Justice means equal outcomes. Patriotism means never questioning the military. Security means giving up privacy. Each claim starts with a common term, then quietly re-engineers it. Now, anyone who disagrees with the new meaning can be framed as opposing the original value. If you challenge security, you're reckless. If you challenge patriotism, you're ungrateful. But the argument was never about values. It was about control over how they're defined. Advertising thrives on this fallacy. Luxury means hand-stitched leather. Clean beauty means plant-based. Smart technology means more features. None of these statements are wrong by definition. They just pick one narrow interpretation and treat it as universal. And once you accept that definition, the product sells itself. The word has been reprogrammed to mean by me in personal relationships. This fallacy shows up in emotional manipulation. A partner says, "If you loved me, you'd do this." They're not proving love requires that action. They're defining it that way. It's no longer a feeling or a bond. It's now a transaction. And the other person is cornered, not by evidence, but by redefinition. In legal and philosophical debate, this fallacy can be used to rig arguments. A debater says, justice is giving each person exactly what they deserve, then builds an argument around that claim, without proving it's the right definition, or even a workable one. The fallacy happens not in the conclusion, but in the setup, where terms are loaded quietly. By the time someone challenges the definition, they're already on the defensive. Why does this fallacy work? Because definitions feel like neutral ground. People assume words have shared meaning, and when someone redefines a term midstream, the shift is often missed, or allowed out of politeness. But definitions are power. Who controls the terms controls the frame, and who controls the frame often wins, even with no argument at all. Spotting the Definist fallacy isn't about becoming a language cop. It's about slowing down when a word becomes the centerpiece of a claim. Ask, is this what the word has always meant? Is this how most people understand it? Or is the argument doing its work by changing the meaning underneath? Ecological Fallacy. A city releases new statistics. It shows that neighborhoods with higher average incomes tend to have lower crime rates. From this, a commentator concludes, people with money don't commit crimes. But that doesn't follow. The data described groups. The conclusion targets individuals. That's the ecological fallacy. When someone makes an inference about a person based on group-level statistics, assuming the characteristics of the collective automatically apply to each member. It's the logic of generalization disguised as statistical reasoning. The fallacy often hides behind charts and percentages. A region may vote a certain way in an election, and analysts might claim everyone who lives there supports that view. But most regions are mixed. One side wins, often narrowly, but the conclusion flattens every voice beneath the average. That's the danger. Averages aren't identities. They're just summaries, and summaries leave out a lot. In health and epidemiology, the fallacy has real-world impact. Suppose a study shows that countries with higher dairy consumption have lower rates of bone fractures. It's tempting to say, dairy prevents fractures. But that leap skips important steps. Who's consuming the dairy? What else do they eat? What are their lifestyles like? Just because a trend appears across populations doesn't mean the same cause-effect exists at the individual level. Patterns may hold in aggregate, but once you zoom in, they can vanish or even reverse. Marketers use this fallacy when segmenting consumers. A luxury car company finds that their buyers tend to be college-educated, so they start marketing only to people with degrees, assuming they all value the same things. But being part of a demographic doesn't predict behavior with precision. Group data can suggest where to look. It can't tell you who a person is. Politically, this fallacy fuels stereotypes. A district with high unemployment may also have high rates of government assistance. So someone concludes, everyone in that community is dependent, but within that group, many may be working multiple jobs, supporting families, paying taxes. The label gets pasted onto every member, regardless of whether it fits. It's a subtle form of dehumanization, not through hatred, but through lazy inference. In urban sociology, ecological fallacy skews perception of crime, poverty, and education. If a school district performs poorly on standardized tests, people assume every student is failing. If a neighborhood is labeled at risk, residents are assumed to be troubled or dangerous. Resources are distributed accordingly, and that creates a feedback loop. Misread data shapes policy, policy shapes opportunity, and opportunity shapes outcomes. What began as an error in logic becomes a real-world consequence. Why does this fallacy persist? Because group data feels powerful. It's big, it looks scientific, it promises objectivity, and when we want quick answers about society, we grab for what's visible, not what's nuanced. But information about a population isn't a map of its people, it's just a wide-angle lens. Details are lost in the distance. The key isn't to reject group data, it's to recognize its limits. When someone draws a conclusion about a person based on group stats, pause. Is the claim rooted in distribution or assumption? Is the individual being understood or just sorted? Because understanding a crowd is useful, but pretending that every voice inside it sings the same note is how truth turns to noise. Etymological fallacy. A man argues that people shouldn't call themselves enthusiastic unless they're literally filled with the divine, because the word once meant possessed by a god. It's clever, it's historical, and it's irrelevant. That's the etymological fallacy, the error of assuming that a word's original meaning must still govern how it's used today, as if definitions are frozen in time. It mistakes linguistic ancestry for authority. Language evolves, meanings drift, and yet this fallacy insists that the past holds veto power over the present. If decimate originally meant to kill 1 in 10, then using it to mean destroy most of something is wrong. If literally meant exactly, then using it for emphasis must be incorrect. But this kind of reasoning puts grammar above meaning, treating dictionaries like moral documents instead of tools for communication. You often see this fallacy in debates about morality or identity. Someone argues, atheist comes from the Greek atheos, meaning without God, so atheists are inherently immoral. But the argument relies not on what the term means now, but what its roots meant in ancient tongues. It's not logic, it's linguistic time travel used to shut people down. In legal and religious debates, this fallacy becomes a tactic. A law is interpreted not by its function or context, but by the oldest possible meaning of one word within it. A religious term is explained based on ancient usage, as if no centuries of theology, translation, or cultural shift have passed. The assumption is that words should never outgrow their birthplace, but when society changes, clinging to linguistic fossils only stalls discourse. Advertisers use this fallacy to build authority. A supplement claims the word vitamin comes from vital and vitam, essential to life, which is true. In 1912, scientists thought all vitamins were amines, but the name stuck even after the science changed. Still, the appeal works. The etymology lends weight, even when it's irrelevant to how the word functions today. It's not deception, it's decoration, sold as truth. In personal reasoning, it becomes a form of intellectual gatekeeping. Someone corrects another for calling a computer program buggy, explaining that the term came from literal insects inside early machines. The correction is factually interesting, but logically meaningless. The word bug now means a flaw. Its origin is trivia, not mandate. But the fallacy works by confusing history with definition. Why does this fallacy persist? Because people conflate roots with rules. If they know a word's origin, they feel like they hold its truth. And that knowledge becomes a weapon, not of understanding, but of authority. It's tempting. History sounds deep, but meaning is use, not origin. The antidote isn't to ignore etymology, it's to recognize what it is. Context, not command. A word's past may be fascinating, but its value lives in how it functions now, in its current role, in the meanings people actually share when they speak it. Language is a living contract. Its terms change. Its clauses expand. And the signature that matters isn't from the past. It's from the people using it today. False equivalence. A headline reads, "Both sides are at fault." The context. One side incited violence, the other protested it, but the headline stands. Clean, symmetrical, and misleading. This is false equivalence, a fallacy that compares two things as if they're morally or logically equal, even when the differences between them are vast and essential. It flattens asymmetry, it erases scale, and it replaces judgment with artificial balance. The fallacy often wears the costume of fairness. In political commentary, it's common to hear, well, both parties lie. Maybe, but are they lying about tax rates or about elections being stolen? The comparison pretends neutrality, but what it delivers is distortion. When unequal things are treated as equal for the sake of appearing unbiased, truth is diluted. You see this in media all the time. A debate segment invites both sides to weigh in on climate change, a climate scientist and a paid lobbyist. One brings decades of data, the other brings a microphone and a PR team. Equal time, unequal substance. But the visual, two experts, two chairs, two voices, tricks the audience into believing the issue is unsettled. The format creates equivalence where there is none. In moral debates, this fallacy shuts down critical thinking. Someone says, rioting is bad, but so is systemic oppression. Both sides are wrong. The problems are now framed as equal offenses, property damage versus decades of human harm. It doesn't excuse violence, but equating isolated actions with systemic injustice replaces inquiry with false symmetry. The comparison doesn't inform, it neutralizes. In relationships, the fallacy becomes a defense mechanism. A partner confronts years of neglect. The other responds, well, you forgot my birthday once. Now both have hurt each other. But the weight, scale, and intent are wildly different. The past is rewritten to feel even when it's not. False equivalence doesn't seek resolution, it seeks escape from responsibility. Historically, this fallacy has been used to blur accountability. During civil rights struggles, critics claimed activists and segregationists were equally extreme. Today, similar language resurfaces to equate protest with repression, or grassroots organizing with authoritarian control. The framing is elegant. Both extremes are dangerous, but one side demands justice, the other resists it. Painting them with the same brush isn't balance, it's erasure. Why does this fallacy persist? Because people are uncomfortable making judgments. It's easier to say everyone's flawed than to weigh consequences. It sounds mature, but it's often a retreat. It allows people to feel informed without taking a stand, to reject discomfort without appearing dishonest, to say something without saying anything at all. To dismantle this fallacy, ask what's actually being compared. Are the stakes, scale, and structure the same, or is the resemblance just surface level? Are you evaluating content, or just symmetry? Because not every action is equal, not every side is comparable, and not every argument deserves a matching opposite. Balance is not the same as accuracy, and sometimes the truth leans hard in one direction. Historian's fallacy. A student reading about the Titanic wonders how anyone could have believed the ship was unsinkable. Why didn't they bring more lifeboats? Why didn't the captain slow down after the iceberg warnings? From a distance, it seems obvious, but no one on board had that distance. They were living the moment, not analyzing it. This is the historian's fallacy, when we judge past decisions with knowledge that wasn't available at the time. It's the mistake of applying modern understanding, hindsight, or outcomes to people who were navigating uncertainty. It's not just unfair, it's lazy. It pretends clarity existed in the fog. The fallacy often starts with a question like, how could they not have seen it coming? About war, collapse, failure, scandal. We forget that patterns only become clear in reverse. Beforehand, they look like noise. Dozens of possible threats. No way to know which one matters. People in the past weren't stupid. They were making decisions with the data they had, often incomplete, conflicting, or shaped by fear, culture, or ideology. You see it in political analysis all the time. Modern commentators wonder how voters in 1930s Germany didn't see Hitler's rise for what it was. But in that moment, many saw nationalism, recovery, order, not genocide. The same applies to any historical upheaval. We ask, why didn't they resist? But forget the cost of resistance, the risks, the propaganda, the lack of certainty about what was coming. Judging their hesitation as cowardice assumes a level of foresight they never had. In moral debates, the fallacy flattens history. We look back at outdated beliefs, racism, sexism, medical ignorance, and wonder why people didn't know better. Some did, many didn't, and often the structures they lived in punished those who tried to think differently. Acknowledging that isn't excusing it, it's understanding the pressure of context. You can condemn a choice without pretending it was made with your perspective. In law, this fallacy affects policy. Judges and juries sometimes evaluate a past action as if the person involved should have predicted the outcome. But people act in real time, without access to the story's ending. This is why self-defense cases turn on perception. Did the person reasonably believe they were in danger? The question isn't what we know now, it's what they could have known then. In personal life, the fallacy shows up in guilt. Someone reflects on a failed relationship and says, I should have seen it. It was so obvious. But they're looking back with the knowledge pain gave them, not the mindset they had when they were hopeful. The version of themselves in the memory isn't operating with their current wisdom, and punishing that version won't make the past cleaner, just heavier. Why does this fallacy take hold? Because hindsight feels like intelligence. If we can explain the past clearly, we think we're smarter than the people who lived it. But we're not. We just know the ending. And knowing the ending always makes the beginning look foolish. To avoid the historian's fallacy, don't just ask what people did, ask what they knew, what they feared, what choices they had, and what consequences they faced. Understanding context isn't weakness. It's what makes judgment worth listening to. The past wasn't a movie. It didn't come with spoilers, and the people inside it were guessing, just like we are now. Inflation of conflict. A journalist invites two scientists onto a panel. One says climate change is real, urgent, and human-driven. The other says it's overblown, maybe even a hoax. The host leans back and smiles. We'll let the audience decide. To the viewer, it looks like a fierce debate. But outside that studio, there's overwhelming consensus. Thousands of studies, decades of research, near unanimity in the scientific community. The disagreement wasn't balanced. It was manufactured. That's the inflation of conflict fallacy. The error of assuming that because a few voices disagree, there must be significant controversy or doubt. It overrepresents dissent, turning fringe objections into apparent stalemates. This fallacy thrives in environments where complexity meets public perception. Science doesn't present itself in slogans. It builds slowly, with uncertainty, error bars, and cautious language. So when a loud dissenter enters the room, confident, simplified, provocative, they capture attention. And the conflict they create feels larger than it is. It becomes spectacle. And in spectacle, scale is easy to fake. In public health, this fallacy delayed progress. When vaccines became available, nearly every expert agreed on their safety, but the news spotlighted a handful of skeptics. One contrarian voice versus thousands of doctors suddenly felt like a genuine dispute. And once the appearance of disagreement was established, doubt took root, not through data, but through imbalance of attention. Academia faces this too. In subjects like evolution, gender studies, or historical analysis, a single critic can be amplified to make it look like foundational theories are crumbling. The reality, no field is perfectly unified, but a 97% consensus isn't the same as a 50-50 split, and treating it that way misleads the public. about how knowledge actually works. Politically, this fallacy is used to stall reform. A policy proposal is supported by economists, sociologists, and legal scholars. But a few well-placed think tank voices push back. Suddenly, the narrative becomes experts disagree. What was once movement turns into paralysis. Because as long as disagreement can be shown, even artificially, action is postponed in the name of being fair. St. Furries life, the same pattern emerges in group dynamics. A team meets to make a decision. 10 people agree, one raises doubts. The manager says, "Let's not move forward yet. It seems we're divided." They're not, they're mostly aligned, but one disagreement got inflated into a deadlock. It's easier to delay than to weigh the disagreement properly. Easier to pretend conflict is equal than to evaluate its content. Why does this fallacy work? Because conflict is magnetic. It grabs attention. It looks like balance, like democracy, like caution. But in truth, it can distort reality when disagreement is mistaken for evidence of doubt. The problem isn't disagreement. It's misrepresenting its scale. To avoid falling into this trap, look closer when someone says experts are divided. Ask how many, how credible, how representative, and what does the weight of evidence really say? Consensus isn't unanimity, but neither is dissent always meaningful. If 10,000 agree and 10 object, there may still be a conversation, but it's not a crisis. And disagreement, by itself, doesn't mean the truth is in dispute. Nirvana Fallacy. Someone proposes a safer, cleaner energy grid. The reply comes instantly. That won't eliminate all emissions, so it's dismissed. Not because it wouldn't help, but because it wouldn't fix everything. That instinct, rejecting a solution because it's not perfect, is the Nirvana Fallacy. It's the mistake of comparing real-world options to idealized, flawless outcomes that don't exist, and using that contrast to justify doing nothing. Perfection becomes the enemy of progress, and proposals that could reduce suffering, save time, cut costs, or improve quality are shot down, not because they're bad, but because they're incomplete. A reform plan is introduced. Will it solve poverty entirely? No, then it's not good enough. But what's being weighed isn't trade-offs, it's fantasy. The fallacy thrives where ideals are strong and patience is weak. In environmental policy, it appears like this. If electric cars still rely on mining and energy, what's the point? As if the only acceptable path is one that solves every issue for everyone immediately. Or in education. If school reforms can't fix every inequity, why even try? The comparison isn't honest. It's punitive. It punishes imperfect ideas for not being miracles. You don't need to invoke perfection directly for this fallacy to work. Sometimes it hides behind the phrase, "That's not enough." Not enough for whom? Compared to what? No answer. Just the suggestion that any flaw invalidates the entire effort. Historically, this mindset has delayed crucial reforms. In early industrial safety movements, labor organizers pushed for basic protections, ventilation, shorter hours, regulated machinery. Critics scoffed. People will still get injured. This won't make work safe. No. But it would make it safer, and that distinction is everything. Refusing progress because it's partial doesn't preserve purity. It preserves the problem. Strangely, this fallacy also shows up in private moments. The kind people don't even realize they're having. A person wants to start therapy, then thinks, "I won't fix everything about me, so what's the point?" Someone tries to apologize, but the other person says, "It doesn't undo the damage." True, but sometimes improvement, not perfection, is all that's possible, and all that's needed. What makes the Nirvana Fallacy feel persuasive is its appeal to principles. It sounds idealistic. It frames rejection as moral clarity, but it masks a deep discomfort with compromise and an avoidance of hard, incremental work. In reality, no system is flawless, no law airtight, no program solves all problems. That's not failure, that's life. The alternative isn't to lower standards, it's to recognize when not perfect still means better. Ask, does this reduce harm? Does it move the needle? Does it solve part of the problem? Because if the only acceptable solution is the perfect one, you'll wait forever while doing nothing. And in that waiting, people suffer, reject fantasy as your benchmark, judge solutions by their impact, not their divinity. Proof by assertion. A claim is repeated once, then again, then louder, then printed on a sign, then spoken on television, then echoed in headlines and hashtags and protest chants. And eventually, people stop asking whether it's true and start assuming it must be. That's proof by assertion. The fallacy of mistaking repetition for validation. It doesn't build an argument. It builds volume and hopes that sheer force of repetition will wear down resistance. You don't have to be convinced, just exhausted. That's the strategy. If a claim is stated confidently, aggressively, and often enough, the audience begins to blur the line between frequency and credibility. What was once a question becomes a common sense assumption, not because it was defended, but because it was drilled in until scrutiny felt unnecessary. In politics, this fallacy is routine. A lie about voter fraud is repeated until voters stop asking for evidence. A catchphrase about economic doom circulates for months, echoed across pundit panels and press releases. After enough time, people begin to cite it casually, even if it's never been supported by data. The goal isn't persuasion through reasoning, it's saturation. Make the claim too familiar to question. Propaganda machines run on this logic. In authoritarian regimes, state-controlled media will repeat fabricated threats, manufactured victories, or demonize scapegoats so relentlessly that citizens no longer know what's real, only what's repeated. And even those who suspect a lie may find it safer to agree, or easier to stay silent. Proof by assertion wears people down, not just intellectually, but emotionally. In consumer culture, you can see this fallacy in advertising. A brand insists it's the best. No comparison, no supporting evidence, just the phrase "number one" printed, chanted, and plastered across every ad. The claim becomes self-reinforcing. The repetition gives it shape. Eventually, people treat it like background truth. But slogans aren't data. Repetition doesn't make something accurate, just familiar. On a smaller scale, this fallacy appears in relationships and conversations. One person says, "You always overreact." Not once, but often enough that the label starts to stick. It's not a pattern proven. It's a narrative repeated, and repetition can sculpt identity, especially when the target stops resisting it. That's how manipulation works, not with facts, but with volume. Why does this tactic work? Because memory is lazy, and repetition triggers fluency. A statement that's been heard 10 times feels easier to recall than one you've only seen once. And the brain, subconsciously, mistakes that ease for truth, familiar, credible. That's how it feels, even when it isn't. Countering proof by assertion takes more than fact-checking. It takes resisting cognitive fatigue. When someone repeats a claim, don't ask how many times it's been said. Ask whether it's ever been shown. Has it been supported, tested, challenged, refined, or has it only been echoed? Because if the only thing holding it up is the noise around it, it's not a truth, it's a chant. Psychologist's fallacy. You see someone at a funeral, they're scrolling through their phone, you whisper to yourself, some people just don't care, but maybe they're reading a eulogy, maybe they're trying not to cry, or maybe their grief doesn't look like yours. What just happened wasn't just a judgment, it was a fallacy. Psychologist's fallacy. The error of assuming your own perspective, experience, or reaction is the correct objective standard for how things are or should be. It's not just about projection. It's about replacing empathy with assumption. William James coined the term, originally referring to how psychologists mistakenly treated their internal states as the measure for others' minds. But the fallacy has expanded far beyond academic settings. It happens anytime someone says, "If I were in that position, I wouldn't feel that way." Or "They can't really be suffering. Look how calm they are." As if emotional response were universal, as if inner worlds were visible on the surface. In ethics, this fallacy can quietly shape injustice. A judge looks at a defendant's background and says, "I came from poverty, and I never turned to crime." The implication is clear. If I didn't, they shouldn't have. But lives are not interchangeable. Circumstance, trauma, and psychology don't distribute evenly. Using your own path as the baseline erases everything that makes another path different. The fallacy also slips into everyday debate. During discussions about discrimination, a common phrase emerges: "I've never seen that happen. I don't think it's a real issue." But absence of personal experience isn't proof of absence in reality. Dismissing structural problems because they weren't part of your story isn't skepticism, it's solipsism. In relationships, it sounds like frustration. "I don't get why you're still upset. I would have moved on by now." But grief, healing, anger, none of these follow universal timelines. People interpret, process, and recover in wildly different ways. The fallacy lies in assuming your emotional default is some kind of gold standard. It's a refusal to step outside yourself. Education systems have suffered from this mindset too. Curricula, designed by people who found school easy, tend to underestimate learning diversity. "If I could do it this way, why can't they?" This logic builds systems that fail not because students are incapable, but because the architecture was drawn from a narrow mental template. It's not ill intent, it's invisible bias. But its consequences are real. Why is the psychologist's fallacy so common? Because it feels like empathy. It tells us we're putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. But often we're just putting ourselves in their situation and imagining how we would feel. True empathy doesn't start with imagining yourself in their place. It starts with recognizing that you aren't, and that they may experience the same world through a radically different lens. When you hear someone say, "That reaction doesn't make sense to me," remember, it doesn't have to. Truth doesn't need to match your intuition, and someone else's mind doesn't need to resemble yours to be valid. Reification Fallacy. A child is told that society wants them to behave. They grow up hearing that the economy is angry, or that science demands obedience. But none of these things have a voice. None can speak, want, or punish. Yet we talk about them as if they do. That's reification, the fallacy of treating an abstract concept as if it were a concrete, living, thinking entity. We take something that doesn't exist physically, an idea, a system, a value, and talk about it like it's a person with beliefs, plans, and agency. And once we give it that voice, we start obeying it like it's real. This fallacy shows up most often in language that sounds serious, wise, and philosophical. Justice has spoken, the market decided. History will judge us. These aren't just metaphors. They often become moral shortcuts, where responsibility disappears and abstraction takes the wheel. No one has to explain who made the decision, or whether it's right. It was the system. It was the algorithm. And with that, human accountability melts away. In politics, reification can become a shield. A leader blames failure on the bureaucracy, as if it's a sentient beast that sabotages good intentions. But bureaucracy is a network of people, rules, and inertia. It doesn't think. It doesn't plot. Calling it a villain allows decision-makers to dodge responsibility, to act like they're in conflict with a force of nature, instead of facing problems they helped build. Religion and ideology often walk the line between metaphor and reification. Faith-based communities may speak of sin or evil not as concepts, but as moving forces in the world. A political movement might describe freedom as if it has a will of its own, something to be pleased, provoked, or defended from corruption. At first, this can be poetic, but when policies, punishments, or wars are justified in service to these entities, the line between symbol and reality collapses. People are no longer acting on beliefs, they're obeying ghosts. You'll also find reification in personal identity. Someone says, "Anxiety won't let me try," or "My trauma is angry today." This isn't just expression. It shifts the speaker's experience into something external, something acting upon them. Sometimes that helps create distance from pain, but it can also become a trap, where people begin to believe they have no say in what they feel, that their emotions are agents, not experiences. In media and marketing, reification gives products and narratives more weight. The planet is crying. America wants unity. Your data is hungry. Each phrase anthropomorphizes something abstract or systemic to provoke empathy, urgency, or fear. And once an idea feels like a living force, it becomes harder to question and easier to follow. Why does this fallacy work? Because the human brain is wired to understand the world in terms of people, things with motives, intentions, and agency. Turning a process into a person helps us relate to it, but it also makes it harder to interrogate, because we don't argue with systems the way we argue with people. We obey, or we resist emotionally, not analytically. To resist the Reification fallacy, ask who is actually speaking, who is making the decision. What does this word actually refer to? Because if no one's behind the curtain, you're just being directed by an illusion. Abstractions don't think. Ideas don't act. Only people do. Never forget who's holding the lever. Retrospective Determinism. A revolution breaks out. A regime collapses. Commentators look back and say, it was inevitable. But at the time, there were 100 other ways it could have gone, half of them more likely. The outcome looks clean in the rear view, but the road there was chaotic, fragile, unpredictable. That's retrospective determinism. The fallacy of believing that because something happened, it had to happen. It's the illusion that history was always headed in one direction and that the ending explains everything that came before it. It creates a false sense of clarity. An event occurs, and we build a narrative around it, connecting dots backward, simplifying choices, stripping away the uncertainty people once faced. A successful entrepreneur is profiled in a magazine. Their early failures are reframed as strategic risks. Their setbacks become formative. Their quirks are called vision. But thousands of others did the same things and didn't succeed. We don't hear about them because we don't build narratives around the invisible. We assume the winner was destined and forget how many others took the same steps and ended up nowhere. This fallacy is especially dangerous in moral judgment. After a tragedy, people ask, how did they not see the signs? How could they have been so blind? But no one had a script. No character wore a label. People acted with partial knowledge, under stress, with limited foresight. The outcome feels obvious only because we already know it. The fallacy turns complexity into condemnation. It assumes that wisdom lives in hindsight, and that those without it were stupid or careless. But clarity after the fact isn't the same as clarity during the moment. Retrospective determinism shapes how wars are taught. A nation wins, and its actions are recast as justified, strategic, even noble. Loses, and they're described as desperate or foolish. But in the fog of war, decisions aren't framed by outcome. They're framed by fear, scarcity, political pressure. Looking backward, everything seems to fit. But that's because the pieces we don't like get trimmed out. In personal life, the fallacy turns into regret and blame, and marriage falls apart. Friends say they were never right for each other, but those same friends toasted at the wedding. Or someone says, I should have known better. But should have known is a verdict handed down with new information, not a fair measure of what was possible at the time. People don't live life like chess. They live it like fog, making choices with partial maps, limited light, and hope. Why is this fallacy so sticky? Because humans are natural storytellers. We crave closure, explanation, order. If something happened, we want to believe it was always going to. That the past followed a path, not 100 tangled possibilities. But believing in inevitability numbs us to real causes. It turns process into fate, and it replaces empathy with judgment. Resisting this fallacy means resisting the urge to narrate backward. It means asking, what did people know then? What were the options on the table? How many forks in the road did we forget? Because if we treat every outcome as predestined, we learn the wrong lessons and carry that blindness forward into the next decision. History doesn't unfold like a prophecy. It stumbles forward, full of false starts, near misses, close calls, and luck. And just because it ended up here doesn't mean it had to. Thought terminating cliché. Everything happens for a reason. It is what it is. Don't overthink it. Just be grateful. These aren't arguments. They're shutdowns. You raise a question, a concern, a contradiction, and instead of a response, you get a phrase that ends the conversation. That's a thought terminating cliché. A phrase designed to halt thinking, stop discomfort, or protect a belief from scrutiny. It gives the illusion of wisdom, but functions like a mental off switch. Coined by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton while studying totalitarian cults, the term described how repetitive slogans were used to suppress dissent. Sayings like doubt is a sign of weakness or obedience is freedom made questioning feel disloyal. But outside of cults, the same mechanism thrives in workplaces, families, schools, and political rhetoric. Anywhere pressure exists to stop people from thinking too deeply. These clichés come in many shapes. Some sound spiritual, let go and let God. Others are wrapped in positivity, good vibes only. Don't be negative. What they all share is this: they flatten complexity. They make discomfort feel impolite, and they redirect attention away from anything inconvenient. A person raises a concern about burnout at work. Someone replies, "Hey, we're all in this together." That's supposed to feel reassuring. But what it really does is erase the original concern. There's no space left to challenge the system, only the expectation to comply with a smile. The cliché did its job. It replaced a difficult truth with a manageable mood. These phrases often become habits. We say them reflexively, not out of manipulation, but out of discomfort. It's easier to say, "That's just life," than to engage with pain, injustice, or failure. But every time we use one of these phrases to avoid complexity, we reinforce the idea that thought itself is dangerous, or at least unwelcome. Media outlets use this fallacy too. In the face of systemic failure, they might say, "This is just the new normal." A war breaks out, and pundits declare, "That region has always been unstable." These statements don't explain. They preempt explanation. They give the audience permission to stop caring. In conflict resolution, the fallacy is often disguised as moving on. Two people argue. One says, "I'm done talking about this," or "Let's agree to disagree," not as a truce, but as a defense, to avoid accountability, to avoid examining who was right or wrong. Closure is forced, not earned. Why do these clichés work? Because silence feels safer than tension. Because questioning makes people uncomfortable. Because in many settings, social, religious, professional, to think too much is treated as a threat to harmony, a threat to control, a threat to the narrative. So the cliché becomes a tool, not to enlighten, but to suppress. To resist this fallacy, ask what's hiding behind the phrase. What question just got buried? What discomfort got deflected? Because when someone throws a verbal blanket over a burning issue, the fire doesn't go out, it just burns quietly, underneath. A real conversation doesn't end with "it is what it is." It starts with, "What do you think it should be instead?" Ignoratio Elenchi. A senator is asked why they voted against healthcare reform. They respond by praising the troops. A company is criticized for underpaying workers. Their CEO replies that they donate to charity. These aren't answers, they're distractions dressed up as arguments. That's Ignoratio Elenchi, a Latin phrase meaning ignorance of refutation. It's the fallacy of responding to a point by addressing something entirely different, then pretending it resolves the issue. Sometimes called the irrelevant conclusion, this fallacy sidesteps the real argument and substitutes one that's easier, safer, or more emotionally satisfying. It doesn't challenge the claim, it evades it. You won't always spot this fallacy right away. It doesn't announce itself with slogans or emotion. It hides behind what sounds like relevance, something broadly connected to the topic, but not the specific point at hand. A parent asks why their teenager broke curfew. The teen replies, "You never trust me." That's not an explanation, it's a pivot, and a powerful one, because it shifts the emotional focus changes the subject, and puts the accuser on the defensive. In political debates, this fallacy appears constantly. A candidate is asked how they'll address rising costs of education. They reply with a story about how hard their parents worked to send them to school. Inspiring, maybe, but irrelevant. The question was about policy. The response is about character. That shift is subtle and strategic. In moral arguments, Ignoratio Elenchi becomes a kind of smoke bomb. Someone points out animal cruelty in industrial farming. The reply is, well, we have bigger issues to deal with, like human trafficking. It sounds serious. It is serious. But it doesn't refute the original point. It overwhelms it. This is how real concerns get buried under rhetorical weight. Not by refuting them, but by drowning them in louder topics. The fallacy thrives in environments where attention is short and emotional resonance wins over logical connection. A public figure is accused of unethical behavior. They respond, "People are just trying to bring me down." Now the focus isn't on the evidence, but on the motives of their critics. It's not an argument, it's misdirection. And misdirection works, especially when the audience is already inclined to sympathize. In courtrooms, lawyers sometimes use this fallacy when they sense the facts aren't in their favor. Instead of dismantling the prosecution's evidence, they appeal to the jury's values. They talk about patriotism, or hard work, or the cost of failure. The jury starts feeling and stops thinking. This fallacy also shows up in academic and online debate. A person makes a detailed point about a specific flaw in reasoning. The response, "Well, I've always believed in X, and it's gotten me this far." That's not a counterargument. It's a resume, and it does nothing to address the actual critique. But it feels like it contributes, and that illusion is the danger. Why is this fallacy so effective? Because it doesn't fight logic with logic. It fights logic with narrative. It steers the audience toward a different conclusion, one that's easier to accept, less threatening, more emotionally comfortable. And once the audience forgets what the original point even was, the fallacy has done its job. To avoid falling for it, or using it, you have to be relentless about focus. What was the actual question? What claim was being made? And does this response directly address it? If not, you're not in an argument, you're in a performance. And when a conversation stops being about the issue, it's not a conclusion, it's a detour in disguise. Circumstantial ad hominem. You're in a conversation about climate change. You bring up rising temperatures, melting glaciers, peer-reviewed data. Someone pauses, then smirks. "Aren't you the guy who drives an SUV?" And just like that, the debate ends. Not because your argument was wrong, but because your circumstances were used to discredit your position. This is circumstantial ad hominem, the fallacy of dismissing an argument by pointing to the personal situation or interests of the speaker, instead of addressing the argument itself. It doesn't challenge the logic, it targets the context, and once the focus shifts to your lifestyle, your job, your privilege, or your background, the content of what you said becomes irrelevant. Not all personal attacks are insults. Some are dressed in curiosity. Of course you'd say that. It benefits you. Or easy for you to say, you've never struggled with this issue. These comments don't engage with truth. They undermine the right to speak, based on perceived bias. The speaker is painted not as wrong, but as incapable of objectivity. In political discourse, this fallacy is everywhere. A wealthy senator proposes tax reform. Critics reply, "He's rich, of course he wants that. Maybe the policy's unfair, maybe it's not." But the critique never touches the content. It ends with who said it, not what was said. The same happens in reverse. A low-income activist calls for social programs. Of course he wants handouts. He's broke. It's not analysis, it's erasure by association. Journalists too face this fallacy. A reporter covers war crimes in a country where they once lived. They're dismissed as emotionally compromised. Another reporter with no connection to the region is dismissed for not understanding the culture. Whatever your situation, someone can claim it disqualifies you. This is how circumstantial ad hominem creates a trap with no exit. If you're close to the issue, you're biased. If you're distant, you're ignorant. In interpersonal dynamics, it becomes a silencing tool. A child tells a parent their rules are unfair. The parent replies, "You don't pay the bills. You don't get to have an opinion." But financial status doesn't determine moral clarity, and power doesn't equal correctness. The fallacy works by shrinking the space a person is allowed to speak from until only the speaker's position matters, and no words from the wrong place are taken seriously. Even in activism, this fallacy turns inward. People call each other out, not for what they said, but for what privilege they have while saying it. Sometimes this criticism is valid. Awareness of perspective matters. But the fallacy begins when the message is discarded entirely because of who said it. A trans person advocating for women's rights? They're accused of speaking outside their lane. A man calling out sexism? He's told he benefits from the system and should stay quiet. But sometimes outsiders are allies. Sometimes insiders are wrong. Truth isn't issued based on your demographic profile. Why does this fallacy stick? Because it feels smart. It feels like we're uncovering hidden motives, like we're seeing through manipulation. But seeing someone's interests isn't the same as refuting their point, and bias, even when real, doesn't disprove a claim. The cure isn't to ignore people's circumstances. It's to separate who they are from what they're saying, and test the argument on its own terms. Because even a hypocrite can be right. Even a flawed messenger can deliver truth. Dismiss the reasoning, not the resume. Tone policing. You're upset. You finally speak up. You lay out your argument clearly, maybe with anger, maybe with urgency. And the response isn't about your point. It's about your tone. Calm down. Try being more civil. If you weren't so emotional, maybe people would listen. Suddenly, your credibility isn't based on evidence. It's based on how softly you deliver it. That's tone policing. The fallacy of dismissing someone's argument because of the way it's expressed, rather than engaging with the content itself. The problem is reframed. Not what's being said, but how it's being said. This tactic shows up everywhere. Discourse becomes uncomfortable. A woman calls out sexism at work. Her manager says, "There's a better way to bring this up." A protester demands justice. A journalist describes them as too aggressive to be taken seriously. The message gets buried under performance standards, and anger, often a logical, earned response to injustice, is treated as disqualifying. Tone policing thrives in systems that value decorum over disruption. Educational institutions encourage respectful dialogue, but punish confrontation, even when it's needed. Workplaces promote professionalism, but weaponize it against dissent. In politics, activists who are calm get ignored, and those who shout get dismissed as radicals. There's no correct tone. There's just a shifting expectation that criticism always arrive in gift wrap. What makes this fallacy powerful is that it pretends to reward reason. I'd listen if you weren't yelling. I agree with your point, just not the way you said it. But in practice, those statements deflect. They shift the burden onto the speaker, insisting they manage not only their argument, but your comfort. The content is untouched. The tone becomes the problem. In social justice movements, this is a chronic barrier. Marginalized groups are told to educate, not attack. But they've already spent decades explaining. The rage is not an obstacle to reason. It is a response to being ignored, gaslit, patronized. Tone policing reframes righteous anger as irrationality. It makes emotion the disqualifier, unless that emotion is calm, detached, and palatable. But not all truth arrives gently, and not all violence is loud. Even in relationships, the fallacy creates imbalance. A partner expresses hurt. The other says, "Why are you being so dramatic?" Now the conversation isn't about harm, it's about volume. The person in pain becomes the problem, not the cause of the pain. It's a subtle form of invalidation, one that demands composure from those already carrying a weight. Why does this fallacy persist? Because people want control, not just over what they hear, but how they hear it. They want dissent in soft voices. They want critique with a smile. Tone policing lets us avoid the discomfort of truth by demanding it arrive in a tone we like. To challenge this fallacy, don't ask, why are they upset? Ask, is what they're saying true? And if it is, it shouldn't matter how it was said. Because tone is a delivery system. It can be sharp, it can be raw, it can be messy. But if the content is real, don't let the packaging stop you from opening the box. Fallacy fallacy. You hear someone make a bad argument. They exaggerate, misuse a term, maybe even commit a clear logical fallacy. You smile. You've caught them. So you conclude, whatever they said must be wrong. But that doesn't follow. That's the fallacy fallacy. The error of assuming that because an argument contains faulty reasoning, its conclusion must also be false. It's a meta mistake, rejecting a claim, not for what it is, but for how poorly it was defended. This fallacy is especially tempting for people who know just enough logic to feel dangerous. You spot a strawman. You hear an appeal to emotion, and you instantly dismiss the entire idea as if bad reasoning guarantees falsehood. But even flawed arguments can land on truth by accident. A person can be right, even if they don't know how to explain why. Think of it like this. Someone says, the sun must revolve around the earth because it looks like it does. The logic is wrong, but you don't prove heliocentrism just by spotting the error. You still need evidence. Spotting a fallacy is a diagnostic, not a verdict. In debates, this fallacy becomes a power move. A speaker says something controversial. A critic points out a minor logical slip, then claims total victory. But correcting someone's structure doesn't automatically refute their conclusion. You have to replace bad reasoning with better reasoning, not just throw a flag on the play. Otherwise, you're just scoring style points. In politics, this fallacy shows up in bad faith takedowns. A speaker makes a passionate case. Maybe it's imprecise. Maybe it leans too hard on rhetoric. But instead of engaging the issue, opponents say, see, they're emotional. Their argument is invalid. The emotion may be a fallacy. The conclusion might still be correct. You can't bypass the content just because the delivery was flawed. Even in science communication, the fallacy causes confusion. A scientist might use a clumsy metaphor. Critics jump in to declare the whole theory flawed. But models are not arguments. And a sloppy explanation of quantum mechanics doesn't disprove quantum mechanics. Clarity is ideal, but clarity isn't the same as truth. Why does this fallacy persist? Because it feels clean. Catching a logical flaw feels like a win. And in a world full of noisy claims, it's tempting to treat logical hygiene as a shortcut to truth. But logic is a tool, not a guarantee. You can follow all the rules and still be wrong. And you can stumble through an explanation and still land on something real. To avoid this trap, remember, spotting a fallacy should prompt investigation, not dismissal. Ask, is the conclusion still plausible? Could it be true for better reasons? Have I rejected the argument or the idea itself? Because rejecting a belief because it was poorly argued is like throwing away a book because someone summarized it badly. Don't mistake bad reasoning for bad reality.